Chapter 9. Her sure deliverance foretold. The next sitting opened on Thursday the 1st of March. 58 judges present, the others resting. As usual, Joan was required to take an oath without reservations. She showed no temper this time. She considered herself well buttressed by the process-verbal compromise which Cauchon was so anxious to repudiate and creep out of, so she merely refused, distinctly and decidedly. And added, in a spirit of fairness and candor. But as to matters set down in the process-verbal, I will freely tell the whole truth, yes, as freely and fully as if I were before the Pope. Here was a chance. We had 2 or 3 popes, then, only one of them could be the true Pope, of course. Everybody judiciously shirked the question of which was the true Pope and refrained from naming him, it being clearly dangerous to go into particulars in this matter. Here was an opportunity to trick an unadvised girl into bringing herself into peril, and the unfair judge lost no time in taking advantage of it. He asked, in a plausibly indolent and absent way, "Which one do you consider to be the true Pope?" The house took an attitude of deep attention, and so waited to hear the answer and see the prey walk into the trap. But when the answer came it covered the judge with confusion, and you could see many people covertly chuckling. For Joan asked in a voice and manner which almost deceived even me, so innocent it seemed. "Are there 2? One of the ablest priests in that body and one of the best swearers there, spoke right out so that half the house heard him, and said, 'By God, it was a masterstroke.' As soon as the judge was better of his embarrassment he came back to the charge. But was prudent and passed by Joan's question. 'Is it true that you received a letter from the Count of Armagnac asking you which of the 3 popes he ought to obey?' 'Yes,' and answered it. Copies of both letters were produced and read. Joan said that hers had not been quite strictly copied. She said she had received the Count's letter when she was just mounting her horse. And added, "So, in dictating a word or 2 of reply I said I would try to answer him from Paris or somewhere where I could be at rest." She was asked again which pope she had considered the right one. I was not able to instruct the Count of Armagnac as to which one he ought to obey. Then she added, with a frank fearlessness which sounded fresh and wholesome in that den of trimmers and shufflers, "But as for me, I hold that we are bound to obey our Lord the Pope who is at Rome." The matter was dropped. They produced and read a copy of Joan's first effort at dictating, her proclamation summoning the English to retire from the siege of Orleans and vacate France, truly a great and fine production for an unpracticed girl of 17. Do you acknowledge as your own the document which has just been read? Yes, except that there are errors in it, words which make me give myself too much importance. I saw what was coming. I was troubled and ashamed. For instance, I did not say, "Deliver up to the maid, rendez à la pucelle," I said, "Deliver up to the king, rendez au roi." And I did not call myself Commander-in-Chief, Chef de Guerre. All those are words which my secretary substituted, or mayhap he misheard me or forgot what I said. She did not look at me when she said it, she spared me that embarrassment. I hadn't misheard her at all, and hadn't forgotten. I changed her language purposely, for she was commander-in-chief and entitled to call herself so, and it was becoming and proper, too, and who was going to surrender anything to the king? At that time a stick, a cipher? If any surrendering was done, it would be to the noble maid of Vaucouleurs, already famed and formidable though she had not yet struck a blow. Ah, there would have been a fine and disagreeable episode, for me, there, if that pitiless court had discovered that the very scribbler of that piece of dictation, secretary to Joan of Arc, was present, and not only present, but helping build the record. And not only that, but destined at a far distant day to testify against lies and perversions smuggled into it by Cauchon and deliver them over to eternal infamy. Do you acknowledge that you dictated this proclamation? I do. Have you repented of it? Do you retract it? Ah, then she was indignant. No. Not even these chains, and she shook them, not even these chains can chill the hopes that I uttered there. And more. She rose, and stood a moment with a divine strange light kindling in her face, then her words burst forth as in a flood, "I warn you now that before 7 years a disaster will smite the English. Oh, many-fold greater than the fall of Orleans. Anne. Silence. Sit down. And then, soon after, they will lose all France. Now consider these things. The French armies no longer existed. The French cause was standing still, our king was standing still, there was no hint that by and by the Constable Richemont would come forward and take up the great work of Joan of Arc and finish it. In face of all this, Joan made that prophecy, made it with perfect confidence, and it came true. For within 5 years Paris fell, 1436, and our king marched into it flying the victor's flag. So the first part of the prophecy was then fulfilled, in fact, almost the entire prophecy, for, with Paris in our hands, the fulfillment of the rest of it was assured. 20 years later all France was ours excepting a single town, Calais. Now that will remind you of an earlier prophecy of Joan's. At the time that she wanted to take Paris and could have done it with ease if our king had but consented, she said that that was the golden time. That, with Paris ours, all France would be ours in 6 months. But if this golden opportunity to recover France was wasted, said she, I give you 20 years to do it in. She was right. After Paris fell, in 1436, the rest of the work had to be done city by city, castle by castle, and it took 20 years to finish it. Yes, it was the first day of March, 1431, there in the court, that she stood in the view of everybody and uttered that strange and incredible prediction. Now and then, in this world, somebody's prophecy turns up correct, but when you come to look into it there is sure to be considerable room for suspicion that the prophecy was made after the fact. But here the matter is different. There in that court Joan's prophecy was set down in the official record at the hour and moment of its utterance, years before the fulfillment, and there you may read it to this day. 25 years after Joan's death the record was produced in the great court of the rehabilitation and verified under oath by Mansion and me. And surviving judges of our court confirmed the exactness of the record in their testimony. Joan's startling utterance on that now so celebrated 1st of March stirred up a great turmoil, and it was some time before it quieted down again. Naturally, everybody was troubled, for a prophecy is a grisly and awful thing, whether one thinks it ascends from hell or comes down from heaven. All that these people felt sure of was, that the inspiration back of it was genuine and puissant. They would have given their right hands to know the source of it. At last the questions began again. How do you know that those things are going to happen? I know it by revelation. And I know it as surely as I know that you sit here before me. This sort of answer was not going to allay the spreading uneasiness. Therefore, after some further dallying the judge got the subject out of the way and took up one which he could enjoy more. What languages do your voices speak? French. Sainte Marguerite, too? Verily, why not? She is on our side, not on the English. Saints and angels who did not condescend to speak English. A grave affront. They could not be brought into court and punished for contempt, but the tribunal could take silent note of Joan's remark and remember it against her, which they did. It might be useful by and by. Do your saints and angels wear jewelry, crowns, rings, earrings? To Joan, questions like these were profane frivolities and not worthy of serious notice. She answered indifferently. But the question brought to her mind another matter, and she turned upon Cauchon and said, I had 2 rings. They have been taken away from me during my captivity. You have one of them. It is the gift of my brother. Give it back to me. If not to me, then I pray that it be given to the church. The judges conceived the idea that maybe these rings were for the working of enchantments. Perhaps they could be made to do Joan a damage. Where is the other ring? The Burgundians have it. Where did you get it? My father and mother gave it to me. Describe it. It is plain and simple and has Jesus and Mary engraved upon it. Everybody could see that that was not a valuable equipment to do devil's work with. So that trail was not worth following. Still, to make sure, one of the judges asked Joan if she had ever cured sick people by touching them with the ring. She said no. Now as concerning the fairies, that were used to abide near by Domremy, whereof there are many reports and traditions. It is said that your godmother surprised these creatures on a summer's night dancing under the tree called l'Arbre Fée de Berilmont. Is it not possible that your pretended saints and angels are but those fairies? Is that in your process? She made no other answer. Have you not conversed with Saint Marguerite and St. Catherine under that tree? I do not know. Or by the fountain near the tree? Yes, sometimes. What promises did they make you? None but such as they had God's warrant for. But what promises did they make? That is not in your process, yet I will say this much, they told me that the king would become master of his kingdom in spite of his enemies. And what else? There was a pause, then she said humbly. They promised to lead me to paradise. If faces do really betray what is passing in men's minds, a fear came upon many in that house, at this time, that maybe, after all, a chosen servant and herald of God was here being hunted to her death. The interest deepened. Movements and whispering ceased, the stillness became almost painful. Have you noticed that almost from the beginning the nature of the questions asked Joan showed that in some way or other the questioner very often already knew his fact before he asked his question? Have you noticed that somehow or other the questioners usually knew just how and where to search for Joan's secrets? That they really knew the bulk of her privacies, a fact not suspected by her, and that they had no task before them but to trick her into exposing those secrets? Do you remember Loiseleur, the hypocrite, the treacherous priest, tool of Cauchon? Do you remember that under the sacred seal of the confessional Joan freely and trustingly revealed to him everything concerning her history save only a few things regarding her supernatural revelations which her voices had forbidden her to tell to anyone, and that the unjust judge, Cauchon, was a hidden listener all the time? Now you understand how the Inquisitors were able to devise that long array of minutely prying questions. Questions whose subtlety and ingenuity and penetration are astonishing until we come to remember Loiseleur's performance and recognize their source. Ah, Bishop of Beauvais, you are now lamenting this cruel iniquity these many years in hell. Yes, verily, unless one has come to your help. There is but one among the redeemed that would do it. And it is futile to hope that that one has not already done it, Joan of Arc. We will return to the questionings. Did they make you still another promise? Yes, but that is not in your process. I will not tell it now, but before 3 months I will tell it you. The judge seems to know the matter he is asking about, already. One gets this idea from his next question. Did your voices tell you that you would be liberated before 3 months? Joan often showed a little flash of surprise at the good guessing of the judges, and she showed one this time. I was frequently in terror to find my mind, which I could not control, criticizing the voices and saying. They counsel her to speak boldly, a thing which she would do without any suggestion from them or anybody else, but when it comes to telling her any useful thing, such as how these conspirators managed to guess their way so skillfully into her affairs, they are always off attending to some other business. I am reverent by nature. And when such thoughts swept through my head they made me cold with fear, and if there was a storm and thunder at the time, I was so ill that I could but with difficulty abide at my post and do my work. Joan answered. That is not in your process. I do not know when I shall be set free, but some who wish me out of this world will go from it before me. It made some of them shiver. Have your voices told you that you will be delivered from this prison? Without a doubt they had, and the judge knew it before he asked the question. Ask me again in 3 months and I will tell you. She said it with such a happy look, the tired prisoner. And I? And Noel Raingesson, drooping yonder? Why, the floods of joy went streaming through us from crown to sole. It was all that we could do to hold still and keep from making fatal exposure of our feelings. She was to be set free in 3 months. That was what she meant, we saw it. The voices had told her so, and told her true to the very day, May 30th. But we know now that they had mercifully hidden from her how she was to be set free, but left her in ignorance. Home again. That was our understanding of it, Noel's and mine, that was our dream. And now we would count the days, the hours, the minutes. They would fly lightly along, they would soon be over. Yes, we would carry our idol home. And there, far from the pomps and tumults of the world, we would take up our happy life again and live it out as we had begun it, in the free air and the sunshine. With the friendly sheep and the friendly people for comrades, and the grace and charm of the meadows, the woods, and the river always before our eyes and their deep peace in our hearts. Yes, that was our dream, the dream that carried us bravely through that 3 months to an exact and awful fulfillment, the thought of which would have killed us, I think, if we had foreknown it and been obliged to bear the burden of it upon our hearts the half of those heavy days. Our reading of the prophecy was this: we believed the king's soul was going to be smitten with remorse, and that he would privately plan a rescue with Joan's old lieutenants, d'Alençon and the Bastard and La Hire, and that this rescue would take place at the end of the 3 months. So we made up our minds to be ready and take a hand in it. In the present and also in later sittings Joan was urged to name the exact day of her deliverance, but she could not do that. She had not the permission of her voices. Moreover, the voices themselves did not name the precise day. Ever since the fulfillment of the prophecy, I have believed that Joan had the idea that her deliverance was going to come in the form of death. But not that death. Divine as she was, dauntless as she was in battle, she was human also. She was not solely a saint, an angel, she was a clay-made girl also, as human a girl as any in the world, and full of a human girl's sensitiveness and tenderness and delicacies. And so, that death. No, she could not have lived the 3 months with that one before her, I think. You remember that the first time she was wounded she was frightened, and cried, just as any other girl of 17 would have done. Although she had known for 18 days that she was going to be wounded on that very day. No, she was not afraid of any ordinary death, and an ordinary death was what she believed the prophecy of deliverance meant, I think, for her face showed happiness, not horror, when she uttered it. Now I will explain why I think as I do. 5 weeks before she was captured in the Battle of Compiègne, her voices told her what was coming. They did not tell her the day or the place, but said she would be taken prisoner and that it would be before the feast of St. John. She begged that death, certain and swift, should be her fate, and the captivity brief, for she was a free spirit, and dreaded the confinement. The voices made no promise, but only told her to bear whatever came. Now as they did not refuse the swift death, a hopeful young thing like Joan would naturally cherish that fact and make the most of it, allowing it to grow and establish itself in her mind. And so now that she was told she was to be delivered in 3 months, I think she believed it meant that she would die in her bed in the prison. And that was why she looked happy and content, the gates of paradise standing open for her, the time so short, you see, her troubles so soon to be over, her reward so close at hand. Yes, that would make her look happy, that would make her patient and bold, and able to fight her fight out like a soldier. Save herself if she could, of course, and try for the best, for that was the way she was made, but die with her face to the front if die she must. Then later, when she charged Cauchon with trying to kill her with a poisoned fish, her notion that she was to be delivered by death in the prison, if she had it, and I believe she had, would naturally be greatly strengthened, you see. But I am wandering from the trial. Joan was asked to definitely name the time that she would be delivered from prison. I have always said that I was not permitted to tell you everything. I am to be set free, and I desire to ask leave of my voices to tell you the day. That is why I wish for delay. Do your voices forbid you to tell the truth? Is it that you wish to know matters concerning the King of France? I tell you again that he will regain his kingdom, and that I know it as well as I know that you sit here before me in this tribunal." She sighed and, after a little pause, added, "I should be dead but for this revelation, which comforts me always." Some trivial questions were asked her about St. Michael's dress and appearance. She answered them with dignity, but one saw that they gave her pain. After a little she said, "I have great joy in seeing him, for when I see him I have the feeling that I am not in mortal sin." She added, "Sometimes Saint Marguerite and Saint Catherine have allowed me to confess myself to them." Here was a possible chance to set a successful snare for her innocence. "When you confessed, were you in mortal sin, do you think?" But her reply did her no hurt. So the inquiry was shifted once more to the revelations made to the king, secrets which the court had tried again and again to force out of Joan, but without success. Now as to the sign given to the king. I have already told you that I will tell you nothing about it. Do you know what the sign was? As to that, you will not find out from me. All this refers to Joan's secret interview with the king, held apart, though 2 or 3 others were present. It was known, through Loiseleur, of course, that this sign was a crown and was a pledge of the verity of Joan's mission. But that is all a mystery until this day, the nature of the crown, I mean, and will remain a mystery to the end of time. We can never know whether a real crown descended upon the king's head, or only a symbol, the mystic fabric of a vision. Did you see a crown upon the king's head when he received the revelation? I cannot tell you as to that, without perjury. Did the king have that crown at Rheims? I think the king put upon his head a crown which he found there. But a much richer one was brought him afterward. Have you seen that one? I cannot tell you, without perjury. But whether I have seen it or not, I have heard say that it was rich and magnificent. They went on and pestered her to weariness about that mysterious crown, but they got nothing more out of her. The sitting closed. A long, hard day for all of us. Chapter 10. The Inquisitors at their wits' end. The court rested a day, then took up work again on Saturday, the 3rd of March. This was one of our stormiest sessions. The whole court was out of patience, and with good reason. These 80 distinguished churchmen, illustrious tacticians, veteran legal gladiators, had left important posts where their supervision was needed. To journey hither from various regions and accomplish a most simple and easy matter, condemn and send to death a country lass of 19 who could neither read nor write, knew nothing of the wiles and perplexities of legal procedure, could not call a single witness in her defense, was allowed no advocate or adviser, and must conduct her case by herself against a hostile judge and a packed jury. In 2 hours she would be hopelessly entangled, routed, defeated, convicted. Nothing could be more certain than this, so they thought. But it was a mistake. The 2 hours had strung out into days. What promised to be a skirmish had expanded into a siege, the thing which had looked so easy had proven to be surprisingly difficult. The light victim who was to have been puffed away like a feather remained planted like a rock, and on top of all this, if anybody had a right to laugh it was the country lass and not the court. She was not doing that, for that was not her spirit, but others were doing it. The whole town was laughing in its sleeve, and the court knew it, and its dignity was deeply hurt. The members could not hide their annoyance. And so, as I have said, the session was stormy. It was easy to see that these men had made up their minds to force words from Joan today which should shorten up her case and bring it to a prompt conclusion. It shows that after all their experience with her they did not know her yet. They went into the battle with energy. They did not leave the questioning to a particular member, no, everybody helped. They volleyed questions at Joan from all over the house, and sometimes so many were talking at once that she had to ask them to deliver their fire one at a time and not by platoons. The beginning was as usual. You are once more required to take the oath pure and simple. I will answer to what is in the process verbal. When I do more, I will choose the occasion for myself. That old ground was debated and fought over inch by inch with great bitterness and many threats. But Joan remained steadfast, and the questionings had to shift to other matters. Half an hour was spent over Joan's apparitions, their dress, hair, general appearance, and so on, in the hope of fishing something of a damaging sort out of the replies, but with no result. Next, the male attire was reverted to, of course. After many well-worn questions had been re-asked, one or two new ones were put forward. Did not the king or the queen sometimes ask you to quit the male dress? That is not in your process. Do you think you would have sinned if you had taken the dress of your sex? I have done best to serve and obey my sovereign lord and master. After a while the matter of Joan's standard was taken up, in the hope of connecting magic and witchcraft with it. Did not your men copy your banner in their pennons? The lancers of my guard did it. It was to distinguish them from the rest of the forces. It was their own idea. Were they often renewed? Yes. When the lances were broken they were renewed. The purpose of the question unveils itself in the next one. Did you not say to your men that pennons made like your banner would be lucky? The soldier spirit in Joan was offended at this puerility. She drew herself up, and said with dignity and fire, "What I said to them was, 'Ride those English down,' and I did it myself." Whenever she flung out a scornful speech like that at these French menials in English livery it lashed them into a rage, and that is what happened this time. There were 10, 20, sometimes even 30 of them on their feet at a time, storming at the prisoner minute after minute, but Joan was not disturbed. By and by there was peace, and the inquiry was resumed. It was now sought to turn against Joan the 1,000 loving honors which had been done her when she was raising France out of the dirt and shame of a century of slavery and castigation. Did you not cause paintings and images of yourself to be made? No. At Arras I saw a painting of myself kneeling in armor before the king and delivering him a letter. But I caused no such things to be made. Were not masses and prayers said in your honor? If it was done it was not by my command. But if any prayed for me I think it was no harm. Did the French people believe you were sent of God? As to that, I know not, but whether they believed it or not, I was not the less sent of God. If they thought you were sent of God, do you think it was well thought? If they believed it, their trust was not abused. What impulse was it, think you, that moved the people to kiss your hands, your feet, and your vestments? They were glad to see me, and so they did those things. And I could not have prevented them if I had had the heart. Those poor people came lovingly to me because I had not done them any hurt, but had done the best I could for them according to my strength. See what modest little words she uses to describe that touching spectacle, her marches about France walled in on both sides by the adoring multitudes. They were glad to see me. Glad? Why, they were transported with joy to see her. When they could not kiss her hands or her feet, they knelt in the mire and kissed the hoof-prints of her horse. They worshipped her. And that is what these priests were trying to prove. It was nothing to them that she was not to blame for what other people did. No, if she was worshipped, it was enough, she was guilty of mortal sin. Curious logic, one must say. Did you not stand sponsor for some children baptized at Rheims? At Troyes I did, and at Saint Denis. And I named the boys Charles, in honor of the king, and the girls I named Joan. Did not women touch their rings to those which you wore? Yes, many did, but I did not know their reason for it. At Rheims was your standard carried into the church? Did you stand at the altar with it in your hand at the coronation? Yes. In passing through the country did you confess yourself in the churches and receive the sacrament? Yes. In the dress of a man? Yes. But I do not remember that I was in armor. It was almost a concession. Almost a half-surrender of the permission granted her by the church at Poitiers to dress as a man. The wily court shifted to another matter. To pursue this one at this time might call Joan's attention to her small mistake, and by her native cleverness she might recover her lost ground. The tempestuous session had worn her and drowsed her alertness. It is reported that you brought a dead child to life in the church at Lagny. Was that in answer to your prayers? As to that, I have no knowledge. Other young girls were praying for the child, and I joined them and prayed also, doing no more than they. Continue. While we prayed it came to life, and cried. It had been dead 3 days, and was as black as my doublet. It was straightway baptized, then it passed from life again and was buried in holy ground. Why did you jump from the tower of Beaurevoir by night and try to escape? I would go to the succor of Compiègne. It was insinuated that this was an attempt to commit the deep crime of suicide to avoid falling into the hands of the English. Did you not say that you would rather die than be delivered into the power of the English? Joan answered frankly, without perceiving the trap. Yes. My words were, that I would rather that my soul be returned unto God than that I should fall into the hands of the English. It was now insinuated that when she came to, after jumping from the tower, she was angry and blasphemed the name of God. And that she did it again when she heard of the defection of the commandant of Soissons. She was hurt and indignant at this, and said, "It is not true. I have never cursed. It is not my custom to swear." Chapter 11. The court reorganized for assassination. A halt was called. It was time. Cauchon was losing ground in the fight, Joan was gaining it. There were signs that here and there in the court a judge was being softened toward Joan by her courage, her presence of mind, her fortitude, her constancy, her piety, her simplicity and candor. Her manifest purity, the nobility of her character, her fine intelligence, and the good brave fight she was making, all friendless and alone, against unfair odds. And there was grave room for fear that this softening process would spread further and presently bring Cauchon's plans in danger. Something must be done, and it was done. Cauchon was not distinguished for compassion, but he now gave proof that he had it in his character. He thought it pity to subject so many judges to the prostrating fatigues of this trial when it could be conducted plenty well enough by a handful of them. Oh, gentle judge! But he did not remember to modify the fatigues for the little captive. He would let all the judges but a handful go, but he would select the handful himself, and he did. He chose tigers. If a lamb or two got in, it was by oversight, not intention, and he knew what to do with lambs when discovered. He called a small council now, and during 5 days they sifted the huge bulk of answers thus far gathered from Joan. They winnowed it of all chaff, all useless matter, that is, all matter favorable to Joan. They saved up all matter which could be twisted to her hurt, and out of this they constructed a basis for a new trial which should have the semblance of a continuation of the old one. Another change. It was plain that the public trial had wrought damage, its proceedings had been discussed all over the town and had moved many to pity the abused prisoner. There should be no more of that. The sittings should be secret hereafter, and no spectators admitted. So Noël could come no more. I sent this news to him. I had not the heart to carry it myself. I would give the pain a chance to modify before I should see him in the evening. On the 10th of March the secret trial began. A week had passed since I had seen Joan. Her appearance gave me a great shock. She looked tired and weak. She was listless and far away, and her answers showed that she was dazed and not able to keep perfect run of all that was done and said. Another court would not have taken advantage of her state, seeing that her life was at stake here, but would have adjourned and spared her. Did this one? No. It worried her for hours, and with a glad and eager ferocity, making all it could out of this great chance, the first one it had had. She was tortured into confusing herself concerning the sign, which had been given the king, and the next day this was continued hour after hour. As a result, she made partial revealments of particulars forbidden by her voices, and seemed to me to state as facts things which were but allegories and visions mixed with facts. The third day she was brighter, and looked less worn. She was almost her normal self again, and did her work well. Many attempts were made to beguile her into saying indiscreet things, but she saw the purpose in view and answered with tact and wisdom. Do you know if Saint Catherine and St. Marguerite hate the English? They love whom our Lord loves, and hate whom he hates. Does God hate the English? Of the love or the hatred of God toward the English I know nothing. Then she spoke up with the old martial ring in her voice and the old audacity in her words, and added, "But I know this, that God will send victory to the French. And that all the English will be flung out of France but the dead ones." Was God on the side of the English when they were prosperous in France? I do not know if God hates the French, but I think that he allowed them to be chastised for their sins. It was a sufficiently naive way to account for a chastisement which had now strung out for 96 years. But nobody found fault with it. There was nobody there who would not punish a sinner 96 years if he could, nor anybody there who would ever dream of such a thing as the Lord's being any shade less stringent than men. Have you ever embraced Saint Marguerite and Saint Catherine? Yes, both of them. The evil face of Cauchon betrayed satisfaction when she said that. When you hung garlands upon l'Arbre Fee Burlemont, did you do it in honor of your apparitions? No. Satisfaction again. No doubt Cauchon would take it for granted that she hung them there out of sinful love for the fairies. When the saints appeared to you, did you bow, did you make reverence, did you kneel? Yes. I did them the most honor and reverence that I could. A good point for Cauchon if he could eventually make it appear that these were no saints to whom she had done reverence, but devils in disguise. Now there was the matter of Joan's keeping her supernatural commerce a secret from her parents. Much might be made of that. In fact, particular emphasis had been given to it in a private remark written in the margin of the process. She concealed her visions from her parents and from everyone. Possibly this disloyalty to her parents might itself be the sign of the satanic source of her mission. Do you think it was right to go away to the wars without getting your parents' leave? It is written one must honor his father and his mother. I have obeyed them in all things but that. And for that I have begged their forgiveness in a letter and gotten it. Ah, you asked their pardon? So you knew you were guilty of sin in going without their leave. Joan was stirred. Her eyes flashed, and she exclaimed. I was commanded of God, and it was right to go. If I had had 100 fathers and mothers and been a king's daughter to boot, I would have gone. Did you never ask your voices if you might tell your parents? They were willing that I should tell them, but I would not for anything have given my parents that pain. To the minds of the questioners this headstrong conduct savored of pride. That sort of pride would move one to see sacrilegious adorations. Did not your voices call you daughter of God? Joan answered with simplicity, and unsuspiciously. Yes, before the siege of Orleans and since, they have several times called me daughter of God. Further indications of pride and vanity were sought. What horse were you riding when you were captured? Who gave it you? The king. You had other things, riches, of the king? For myself I had horses and arms, and money to pay the service in my household. Had you not a treasury? Yes. 10 or 12,000 crowns. Then she said with naivete, it was not a great sum to carry on a war with. You have it yet? No. It is the king's money. My brothers hold it for him. What were the arms which you left as an offering in the church of Saint Denis? My suit of silver mail and a sword. Did you put them there in order that they might be adored? No. It was but an act of devotion. And it is the custom of men of war who have been wounded to make such offering there. I had been wounded before Paris. Nothing appealed to these stony hearts, those dull imaginations, not even this pretty picture, so simply drawn. Of the wounded girl soldier hanging her toy harness there in curious companionship with the grim and dusty iron mail of the historic defenders of France. No, there was nothing in it for them, nothing, unless evil and injury for that innocent creature could be gotten out of it somehow. Which aided most, you the standard, or the standard you? Whether it was the standard or whether it was I, is nothing, the victories came from God. But did you base your hopes of victory in yourself or in your standard? In neither. In God, and not otherwise. Was not your standard waved around the king's head at the coronation? No. It was not. Why was it that your standard had place at the crowning of the king in the cathedral of Reims, rather than those of the other captains? Then, soft and low, came that touching speech which will live as long as language lives, and pass into all tongues, and move all gentle hearts wheresoever it shall come. Down to the latest day. It had borne the burden, it had earned the honor. 7. How simple it is, and how beautiful. And how it beggars the studied eloquence of the masters of oratory. Eloquence was a native gift of Joan of Arc. It came from her lips without effort and without preparation. Her words were as sublime as her deeds, as sublime as her character. They had their source in a great heart and were coined in a great brain. Chapter 12. Joan's Masterstroke Diverted. Now, as a next move, this small secret court of holy assassins did a thing so base that even at this day, in my old age, it is hard to speak of it with patience. In the beginning of her commerce with her voices there at Domremy, the child Joan solemnly devoted her life to God, vowing her pure body and her pure soul to his service. You will remember that her parents tried to stop her from going to the wars by hailing her to the court at Toul to compel her to make a marriage which she had never promised to make, a marriage with our poor, good, windy, big, hard-fighting, and most dear and lamented comrade, the standard-bearer, who fell in honorable battle and sleeps with God these 60 years, peace to his ashes. And you will remember how Joan, 16 years old, stood up in that venerable court and conducted her case all by herself, and tore the poor paladin's case to rags and blew it away with a breath. And how the astonished old judge on the bench spoke of her as this marvelous child. You remember all that. Then think what I felt, to see these false priests, here in the tribunal wherein Joan had fought a fourth lone fight in 3 years. Deliberately twist that matter entirely around and try to make out that Joan hailed the paladin into court and pretended that he had promised to marry her, and was bent on making him do it. Certainly there was no baseness that those people were ashamed to stoop to in their hunt for that friendless girl's life. What they wanted to show was this, that she had committed the sin of relapsing from her vow and trying to violate it. Joan detailed the true history of the case, but lost her temper as she went along, and finished with some words for Cauchon which he remembers yet. Whether he is fanning himself in the world he belongs in or has swindled his way into the other. The rest of this day and part of the next the court labored upon the old theme, the male attire. It was shabby work for those grave men to be engaged in. For they well knew one of Joan's reasons for clinging to the male dress was, that soldiers of the guard were always present in her room whether she was asleep or awake. And that the male dress was a better protection for her modesty than the other. The court knew that one of Joan's purposes had been the deliverance of the exiled Duke of Orleans, and they were curious to know how she had intended to manage it. Her plan was characteristically businesslike, and her statement of it as characteristically simple and straightforward. I would have taken English prisoners enough in France for his ransom. And failing that, I would have invaded England and brought him out by force. That was just her way. If a thing was to be done, it was love first, and hammer and tongs to follow. But no shilly-shollying between. She added with a little sigh. If I had had my freedom 3 years, I would have delivered him. Have you the permission of your voices to break out of prison whenever you can? I have asked their leave several times, but they have not given it. I think it is as I have said, she expected the deliverance of death, and within the prison walls, before the 3 months should expire. Would you escape if you saw the doors open? She spoke up frankly and said, yes, for I should see in that the permission of our Lord. God helps who help themselves, the proverb says. But except I thought I had permission, I would not go. Now, then, at this point, something occurred which convinces me, every time I think of it, and it struck me so at the time, that for a moment, at least, her hopes wandered to the king. and put into her mind the same notion about her deliverance which Noel and I had settled upon, a rescue by her old soldiers. I think the idea of the rescue did occur to her, but only as a passing thought, and that it quickly passed away. Some remark of the Bishop of Beauvais moved her to remind him once more that he was an unfair judge, and had no right to preside there, and that he was putting himself in great danger. "What danger?" he asked. "I do not know. Saint Catherine has promised me help, but I do not know the form of it. I do not know whether I am to be delivered from this prison or whether when you sent me to the scaffold there will happen a trouble by which I shall be set free. Without much thought as to this matter, I am of the opinion that it may be one or the other." After a pause she added these words, memorable forever, words whose meaning she may have miscaught, misunderstood, as to that we can never know. Words which she may have rightly understood, as to that, also, we can never know. But words whose mystery fell away from them many a year ago and revealed their meaning to all the world. "But what my voices have said clearest is, that I shall be delivered by a great victory." She paused, my heart was beating fast. For to me that great victory meant the sudden bursting in of our old soldiers with the war cry and clash of steel at the last moment and the carrying off of Joan of Arc in triumph. But, oh, that thought had such a short life. For now she raised her head and finished, with those solemn words which men still so often quote and dwell upon, words which filled me with fear, they sounded so like a prediction. "And always they say, submit to whatever comes, do not grieve for your martyrdom, from it you will ascend into the kingdom of paradise." Was she thinking of fire and the stake? I think not. I thought of it myself, but I believe she was only thinking of this slow and cruel martyrdom of chains and captivity and insult. Surely, martyrdom was the right name for it. It was Jean de La Fontaine who was asking the questions. He was willing to make the most he could out of what she had said. "As the voices have told you, you are going to paradise. You feel certain that that will happen and that you will not be damned in hell. Is that so?" "I believe what they told me. I know that I shall be saved." It is a weighty answer. To me the knowledge that I shall be saved is a great treasure. Do you think that after that revelation you could be able to commit mortal sin? As to that, I do not know. My hope for salvation is in holding fast to my oath to keep my body and my soul pure. Since you know you are to be saved, do you think it necessary to go to confession? The snare was ingeniously devised, but Joan's simple and humble answer left it empty. One cannot keep his conscience too clean. We were now arriving at the last day of this new trial. Joan had come through the ordeal well. It had been a long and wearisome struggle for all concerned. All ways had been tried to convict the accused, and all had failed, thus far. The Inquisitors were thoroughly vexed and dissatisfied. However, they resolved to make one more effort, put in one more day's work. This was done, March 17th. Early in the sitting a notable trap was set for Joan. "Will you submit to the determination of the Church all your words and deeds, whether good or bad?" That was well planned. Joan was in imminent peril now. If she should heedlessly say yes, it would put her mission itself upon trial, and one would know how to decide its source and character promptly. If she should say no, she would render herself chargeable with the crime of heresy. But she was equal to the occasion. She drew a distinct line of separation between the Church's authority over her as a subject member, and the matter of her mission. She said she loved the Church and was ready to support the Christian faith with all her strength. But as to the works done under her mission, those must be judged by God alone, who had commanded them to be done. The judge still insisted that she submit them to the decision of the Church. She said, "I will submit them to our Lord who sent me. It would seem to me that he and his Church are one, and that there should be no difficulty about this matter." Then she turned upon the judge and said, "Why do you make a difficulty when there is no room for any?" Then Jean de La Fontaine corrected her notion that there was but one Church. There were two, the Church triumphant, which is God, the saints, the angels, and the redeemed, and has its seat in heaven. And the Church militant, which is our Holy Father the Pope, Vicar of God, the prelates, the clergy and all good Christians and Catholics, the which Church has its seat in the earth, is governed by the Holy Spirit, and cannot err. Will you not submit those matters to the Church militant? I am come to the King of France from the Church triumphant on high by its commandant, and to that Church I will submit all those things which I have done. For the Church militant I have no other answer now. The court took note of this straightly worded refusal, and would hope to get profit out of it. But the matter was dropped for the present, and a long chase was then made over the old hunting ground, the fairies, the visions, the male attire, and all that. In the afternoon the satanic bishop himself took the chair and presided over the closing scenes of the trial. Along toward the finish, this question was asked by one of the judges. You have said to my lord the bishop that you would answer him as you would answer before our Holy Father the Pope. And yet there are several questions which you continually refuse to answer. Would you not answer the Pope more fully than you have answered before my lord of Beauvais? Would you not feel obliged to answer the Pope, who is the Vicar of God, more fully? Now a thunderclap fell out of a clear sky. Take me to the Pope. I will answer to everything that I ought to. It made the bishop's purple face fairly blanch with consternation. If Joan had only known, if she had only known. She had lodged a mine under this black conspiracy able to blow the bishop's schemes to the four winds of heaven, and she didn't know it. She had made that speech by mere instinct, not suspecting what tremendous forces were hidden in it, and there was none to tell her what she had done. I knew, and Mansion knew. And if she had known how to read writing we could have hoped to get the knowledge to her somehow, but speech was the only way, and none was allowed to approach her near enough for that. So there she sat, once more Joan of Arc the victorious, but all unconscious of it. She was miserably worn and tired, by the long day's struggle and by illness, or she must have noticed the effect of that speech and divined the reason of it. She had made many masterstrokes, but this was the masterstroke. It was an appeal to Rome. It was her clear right. And if she had persisted in it Cauchon's plot would have tumbled about his ears like a house of cards, and he would have gone from that place the worst beaten man of the century. He was daring, but he was not daring enough to stand up against that demand if Joan had urged it. But no, she was ignorant, poor thing, and did not know what a blow she had struck for life and liberty. France was not the Church. Rome had no interest in the destruction of this messenger of God. Rome would have given her a fair trial, and that was all that her cause needed. From that trial she would have gone forth free, and honored, and blessed. But it was not so fated. Cauchon at once diverted the questions to other matters and hurried the trial quickly to an end. As Joan moved feebly away, dragging her chains, I felt stunned and dazed, and kept saying to myself, such a little while ago she said the saving word and could have gone free. And now, there she goes to her death. Yes, it is to her death, I know it, I feel it. They will double the guards. They will never let any come near her now between this and her condemnation, lest she get a hint and speak that word again. This is the bitterest day that has come to me in all this miserable time. Chapter 13. The third trial fails. So the second trial in the prison was over. Over, and no definite result. The character of it I have described to you. It was baser in one particular than the previous one, for this time the charges had not been communicated to Joan, therefore she had been obliged to fight in the dark. There was no opportunity to do any thinking beforehand, there was no foreseeing what traps might be set, and no way to prepare for them. Truly it was a shabby advantage to take of a girl situated as this one was. One day, during the course of it, an able lawyer of Normandy, Maître Loyer, happened to be in Rouen, and I will give you his opinion of that trial. So that you may see that I have been honest with you, and that my partisanship has not made me deceive you as to its unfair and illegal character. Cauchon showed Loyer the process and asked his opinion about the trial. Now this was the opinion which he gave to Cauchon. He said that the whole thing was null and void. For these reasons, 1. Because the trial was secret, and full freedom of speech and action on the part of those present not possible. 2. Because the trial touched the honor of the King of France, yet he was not summoned to defend himself, nor anyone appointed to represent him. 3. Because the charges against the prisoner were not communicated to her. 4. Because the accused, although young and simple, had been forced to defend her cause without help of counsel, notwithstanding she had so much at stake. Did that please Bishop Cauchon? It did not. He burst out upon Lawyer with the most savage cursings, and swore he would have him drowned. Lawyer escaped from Rouen and got out of France with all speed, and so saved his life. Well, as I have said, the second trial was over, without definite result. But Cauchon did not give up. He could trump up another. And still another and another, if necessary. He had the half-promise of an enormous prize, the Archbishopric of Rouen, if he should succeed in burning the body and damning to hell the soul of this young girl who had never done him any harm. And such a prize as that, to a man like the Bishop of Beauvais, was worth the burning and damning of 50 harmless girls, let alone one. So he set to work again straight off next day. And with high confidence, too, intimating with brutal cheerfulness that he should succeed this time. It took him and the other scavengers 9 days to dig matter enough out of Joan's testimony and their own inventions to build up the new mass of charges. And it was a formidable mass indeed, for it numbered 66 articles. This huge document was carried to the castle the next day, March 27th. And there, before a dozen carefully selected judges, the new trial was begun. Opinions were taken, and the tribunal decided that Joan should hear the articles read this time. Maybe that was on account of Lawyer's remark upon that head, or maybe it was hoped that the reading would kill the prisoner with fatigue, for, as it turned out, this reading occupied several days. It was also decided that Joan should be required to answer squarely to every article, and that if she refused she should be considered convicted. You see, Cauchon was managing to narrow her chances more and more all the time. He was drawing the toils closer and closer. Joan was brought in, and the Bishop of Beauvais opened with a speech to her which ought to have made even himself blush, so laden it was with hypocrisy and lies. He said that this court was composed of holy and pious churchmen whose hearts were full of benevolence and compassion toward her, and that they had no wish to hurt her body, but only a desire to instruct her and lead her into the way of truth and salvation. Why, this man was born a devil. Now think of his describing himself and those hardened slaves of his in such language as that. And yet, worse was to come. For now, having in mind another of Laviere's hints, he had the cold effrontery to make to Joan a proposition which, I think, will surprise you when you hear it. He said that this court, recognizing her untaught estate and her inability to deal with the complex and difficult matters which were about to be considered, had determined, out of their pity and their mercifulness, to allow her to choose one or more persons out of their own number to help her with counsel and advice. Think of that, a court made up of Loiseleur and his breed of reptiles. It was granting leave to a lamb to ask help of a wolf. Joan looked up to see if he was serious, and perceiving that he was at least pretending to be, she declined, of course. The bishop was not expecting any other reply. He had made a show of fairness and could have it entered on the minutes, therefore he was satisfied. Then he commanded Joan to answer straightly to every accusation, and threatened to cut her off from the church if she failed to do that or delayed her answers beyond a given length of time. Yes, he was narrowing her chances down, step by step. Thomas de Courcelles began the reading of that interminable document, article by article. Joan answered to each article in its turn. Sometimes merely denying its truth, sometimes by saying her answer would be found in the records of the previous trials. What a strange document that was, and what an exhibition and exposure of the heart of man, the one creature authorized to boast that he is made in the image of God. To know Joan of Arc was to know one who was wholly noble, pure, truthful, brave, compassionate, generous, pious, unselfish, modest, blameless as the very flowers in the fields, a nature fine and beautiful, a character supremely great. To know her from that document would be to know her as the exact reverse of all that. Nothing that she was appears in it, everything that she was not appears there in detail. Consider some of the things it charges against her, and remember who it is speaking of. It calls her a sorceress, a false prophet, an invoker and companion of evil spirits, a dealer in magic, a person ignorant of the Catholic faith, a schismatic. She is sacrilegious, an idolater, an apostate, a blasphemer of God and his saints, scandalous, seditious, a disturber of the peace. She incites men to war, and to the spilling of human blood. She discards the decencies and proprieties of her sex, irreverently assuming the dress of a man and the vocation of a soldier. She beguiles both princes and people. She usurps divine honors, and has caused herself to be adored and venerated, offering her hands and her vestments to be kissed. There it is, every fact of her life distorted, perverted, reversed. As a child she had loved the fairies, she had spoken a pitying word for them when they were banished from their home. She had played under their tree and around their fountain, hence she was a comrade of evil spirits. She had lifted France out of the mud and moved her to strike for freedom, and led her to victory after victory, hence she was a disturber of the peace, as indeed she was. And a provoker of war, as indeed she was again. And France will be proud of it and grateful for it for many a century to come. And she had been adored, as if she could help that, poor thing, or was in any way to blame for it. The cowed veteran and the wavering recruit had drunk the spirit of war from her eyes and touched her sword with theirs and moved forward invincible, hence she was a sorceress. And so the document went on, detail by detail, turning these waters of life to poison, this gold to dross, these proofs of a noble and beautiful life to evidences of a foul and odious one. Of course, the 66 articles were just a rehash of the things which had come up in the course of the previous trials, so I will touch upon this new trial but lightly. In fact, Joan went but little into detail herself, usually merely saying, "That is not true, passes outre." Or, "I have answered that before, let the clerk read it in his record," or saying some other brief thing. She refused to have her mission examined and tried by the earthly church. The refusal was taken note of. She denied the accusation of idolatry and that she had sought men's homage. She said, "If any kissed my hands and my vestments it was not by my desire, and I did what I could to prevent it." She had the pluck to say to that deadly tribunal that she did not know the fairies to be evil beings. She knew it was a perilous thing to say, but it was not in her nature to speak anything but the truth when she spoke at all. Danger had no weight with her in such things. Note was taken of her remark. She refused, as always before, when asked if she would put off the male attire if she were given permission to commune. And she added this: "When one receives the sacrament, the manner of his dress is a small thing and of no value in the eyes of our Lord." She was charged with being so stubborn in clinging to her male dress that she would not lay it off even to get the blessed privilege of hearing Mass. She spoke out with spirit and said, "I would rather die than be untrue to my oath to God." She was reproached with doing man's work in the wars and thus deserting the industries proper to her sex. She answered, with some little touch of soldierly disdain, "As to the matter of women's work, there's plenty to do it. It was always a comfort to me to see the soldier spirit crop up in her. While that remained in her she would be Joan of Arc, and able to look trouble and fate in the face. It appears that this mission of yours which you claim you had from God, was to make war and pour out human blood." Joan replied quite simply, contenting herself with explaining that war was not her first move, but her second. "To begin with, I demanded that peace should be made. If it was refused, then I would fight." The judge mixed the Burgundians and English together in speaking of the enemy which Joan had come to make war upon. But she showed that she made a distinction between them by act and word, the Burgundians being Frenchmen and therefore entitled to less brusque treatment than the English. She said, "As to the Duke of Burgundy, I required of him, both by letters and by his ambassadors, that he make peace with the king. As to the English, the only peace for them was that they leave the country and go home. Then she said that even with the English she had shown a pacific disposition, since she had warned them away by proclamation before attacking them. If they had listened to me, said she, they would have done wisely. At this point she uttered her prophecy again, saying with emphasis, before 7 years they will see it themselves. Then they presently began to pester her again about her male costume, and tried to persuade her to voluntarily promise to discard it. I was never deep, so I think it no wonder that I was puzzled by their persistency in what seemed a thing of no consequence, and could not make out what their reason could be. But we all know now. We all know now that it was another of their treacherous projects. Yes, if they could but succeed in getting her to formally discard it, they could play a game upon her which would quickly destroy her. So they kept at their evil work until at last she broke out and said, "Peace. Without the permission of God I will not lay it off though you cut off my head." At one point she corrected the process verbal, saying, "It makes me say that everything which I have done was done by the counsel of our Lord. I did not say that, I said all which I have well done." Doubt was cast upon the authenticity of her mission because of the ignorance and simplicity of the messenger chosen. Joan smiled at that. She could have reminded these people that our Lord, who is no respecter of persons, had chosen the lowly for his high purposes even oftener than he had chosen bishops and cardinals. But she phrased her rebuke in simpler terms. It is the prerogative of our Lord to choose his instruments where he will. She was asked what form of prayer she used in invoking counsel from on high. She said the form was brief and simple. Then she lifted her pallid face and repeated it, clasping her chained hands. "Most dear God, in honor of your holy passion I beseech you, if you love me, that you will reveal to me what I am to answer to these churchmen. As concerns my dress, I know by what command I have put it on, but I know not in what manner I am to lay it off. I pray you tell me what to do." She was charged with having dared, against the precepts of God and his saints, to assume empire over men and make herself commander-in-chief. That touched the soldier in her. She had a deep reverence for priests, but the soldier in her had but small reverence for a priest's opinions about war. So, in her answer to this charge she did not condescend to go into any explanations or excuses, but delivered herself with bland indifference and military brevity. If I was commander-in-chief, it was to thrash the English. Death was staring her in the face here all the time, but no matter. She dearly loved to make these English-hearted Frenchmen squirm, and whenever they gave her an opening she was prompt to jab her sting into it. She got great refreshment out of these little episodes. Her days were a desert, these were the oases in it. Her being in the wars with men was charged against her as an indelicacy. She said, "I had a woman with me when I could, in towns and lodgings. In the field I always slept in my armor." That she and her family had been ennobled by the king was charged against her as evidence that the source of her deeds were sordid self-seeking. She answered that she had not asked this grace of the king, it was his own act. This third trial was ended at last. And once again there was no definite result. Possibly a fourth trial might succeed in defeating this apparently unconquerable girl. So the malignant bishop set himself to work to plan it. He appointed a commission to reduce the substance of the 66 articles to 12 compact lies, as a basis for the new attempt. This was done. It took several days. Meantime Cauchon went to Joan's cell one day, with Manchon and 2 of the judges, Isambard de la Pierre and Martin Ladvenu, to see if he could not manage somehow to beguile Joan into submitting her mission to the examination and decision of the church militant, that is to say, to that part of the church militant which was represented by himself and his creatures. Joan once more positively refused. Isambard de la Pierre had a heart in his body, and he so pitied this persecuted poor girl that he ventured to do a very daring thing. For he asked her if she would be willing to have her case go before the Council of Basel, and said it contained as many priests of her party as of the English party. Joan cried out that she would gladly go before so fairly constructed a tribunal as that. But before Isambard could say another word, Cauchon turned savagely upon him and exclaimed, "Shut up, in the devil's name!" Then Mansion ventured to do a brave thing, too, though he did it in great fear for his life. He asked Cauchon if he should enter Joan's submission to the Council of Basel upon the minutes. "No. It is not necessary." "Ah," said poor Joan, reproachfully, "you set down everything that is against me, but you will not set down what is for me." It was piteous. It would have touched the heart of a brute. But Cauchon was more than that. Chapter 14. Joan struggles with her 12 lies. We were now in the first days of April. Joan was ill. She had fallen ill the 29th of March, the day after the close of the third trial, and was growing worse when the scene which I have just described occurred in her cell. It was just like Cauchon to go there and try to get some advantage out of her weakened state. Let us note some of the particulars in the new indictment, the 12 lies. Part of the first one says Joan asserts that she has found her salvation. She never said anything of the kind. It also says she refuses to submit herself to the church. Not true. She was willing to submit all her acts to this Rouen tribunal except those done by the command of God in fulfillment of her mission. Those she reserved for the judgment of God. She refused to recognize Cauchon and his serfs as the church, but was willing to go before the Pope or the Council of Basel. A clause of another of the 12 says she admits having threatened with death those who would not obey her. Distinctly false. Another clause says she declares that all she has done has been done by command of God. What she really said was, all that she had done well, a correction made by herself as you have already seen. Another of the 12 says she claims that she has never committed any sin. She never made any such claim. Another makes the wearing of the male dress a sin. If it was, she had high Catholic authority for committing it, that of the Archbishop of Reims and the Tribunal of Poitiers. The 10th article was resentful against her for pretending that St. Catherine and Saint Marguerite spoke French and not English, and were French in their politics. The 12 were to be submitted first to the learned doctors of theology of the University of Paris for approval. They were copied out and ready by the night of April 4th. Then Mansion did another bold thing. He wrote in the margin that many of the 12 put statements in Joan's mouth which were the exact opposite of what she had said. That fact would not be considered important by the University of Paris, and would not influence its decision or stir its humanity. In case it had any, which it hadn't when acting in a political capacity, as at present, but it was a brave thing for that good Mansion to do, all the same. The 12 were sent to Paris next day, April 5th. That afternoon there was a great tumult in Rouen, and excited crowds were flocking through all the chief streets, chattering and seeking for news. For a report had gone abroad that Joan of Arc was sick until death. In truth, these long séances had worn her out, and she was ill indeed. The heads of the English party were in a state of consternation. For if Joan should die uncondemned by the Church and go to the grave unsmirched, the pity and the love of the people would turn her wrongs and sufferings and death into a holy martyrdom. And she would be even a mightier power in France dead than she had been when alive. The Earl of Warwick and the English Cardinal, Winchester, hurried to the castle and sent messengers flying for physicians. Warwick was a hard man, a rude, coarse man, a man without compassion. There lay the sick girl stretched in her chains in her iron cage, not an object to move man to ungentle speech, one would think. Yet Warwick spoke right out in her hearing and said to the physicians, "Mind you take good care of her. The King of England has no mind to have her die a natural death. She is dear to him, for he bought her dear, and he does not want her to die, save at the stake. Now then, mind you cure her." The doctors asked Joan what had made her ill. She said the Bishop of Beauvais had sent her a fish and she thought it was that. Then Jean d'Estevette burst out on her, and called her names and abused her. He understood Joan to be charging the bishop with poisoning her, you see. And that was not pleasing to him, for he was one of Cauchon's most loving and conscienceless slaves, and it outraged him to have Joan injure his master in the eyes of these great English chiefs. These being men who could ruin Cauchon and would promptly do it if they got the conviction that he was capable of saving Joan from the stake by poisoning her and thus cheating the English out of all the real value gainable by her purchase from the Duke of Burgundy. Joan had a high fever, and the doctors proposed to bleed her. Warwick said, "Be careful about that, she is smart and is capable of killing herself." He meant that to escape the stake she might undo the bandage and let herself bleed to death. But the doctors bled her anyway, and then she was better. Not for long, though. Jean d'Estevette could not hold still, he was so worried and angry about the suspicion of poisoning which Joan had hinted at. So he came back in the evening and stormed at her till he brought the fever all back again. When Warwick heard of this he was in a fine temper, you may be sure, for here was his prey threatening to escape again, and all through the overzeal of this meddling fool. Warwick gave d'Estevette a quite admirable cursing, admirable as to strength, I mean, for it was said by persons of culture that the art of it was not good, and after that the meddler kept still. Joan remained ill more than 2 weeks, then she grew better. She was still very weak, but she could bear a little persecution now without much danger to her life. It seemed to Cauchon a good time to furnish it. So he called together some of his doctors of theology and went to her dungeon. Mansion and I went along to keep the record, that is, to set down what might be useful to Cauchon, and leave out the rest. The sight of Joan gave me a shock. Why, she was but a shadow. It was difficult for me to realize that this frail little creature with the sad face and drooping form was the same Joan of Arc that I had so often seen, all fire and enthusiasm, charging through a hail of death and the lightning and thunder of the guns at the head of her battalions. It wrung my heart to see her looking like this. But Cauchon was not touched. He made another of those conscienceless speeches of his, all dripping with hypocrisy and guile. He told Joan that among her answers had been some which had seemed to endanger religion. And as she was ignorant and without knowledge of the Scriptures, he had brought some good and wise men to instruct her, if she desired it. Said he, "We are churchmen, and disposed by our good will as well as by our vocation to procure for you the salvation of your soul and your body, in every way in our power. Just as we would do the like for our nearest kin or for ourselves. In this we but follow the example of Holy Church, who never closes the refuge of her bosom against any that are willing to return." Joan thanked him for these sayings and said, "I seem to be in danger of death from this malady. If it be the pleasure of God that I die here, I beg that I may be heard in confession and also receive my Saviour, and that I may be buried in consecrated ground." Cauchon thought he saw his opportunity at last. This weakened body had the fear of an unblessed death before it and the pains of hell to follow. This stubborn spirit would surrender now. So he spoke out and said, "Then if you want the sacraments, you must do as all good Catholics do, and submit to the Church." He was eager for her answer. But when it came there was no surrender in it, she still stood to her guns. She turned her head away and said wearily, "I have nothing more to say." Cauchon's temper was stirred, and he raised his voice threateningly and said that the more she was in danger of death the more she ought to amend her life. And again he refused the thing she begged for unless she would submit to the Church. Joan said, "If I die in this prison I beg you to have me buried in holy ground. If you will not, I cast myself upon my Saviour." There was some more conversation of the like sort. Then Cauchon demanded again, and imperiously, that she submit herself and all her deeds to the Church. His threatening and storming went for nothing. That body was weak, but the spirit in it was the spirit of Joan of Arc. And out of that came the steadfast answer which these people were already so familiar with and detested so sincerely. "Let come what may. I will neither do nor say any otherwise than I have said already in your tribunals." Then the good theologians took turn about and worried her with reasonings and arguments and scriptures. And always they held the lure of the sacraments before her famishing soul, and tried to bribe her with them to surrender her mission to the Church's judgment. that is to their judgment, as if they were the church. But it availed nothing. I could have told them that beforehand, if they had asked me. But they never asked me anything, I was too humble a creature for their notice. Then the interview closed with a threat of fearful import. A threat calculated to make a Catholic Christian feel as if the ground were sinking from under him. The Church calls upon you to submit, disobey, and she will abandon you as if you were a pagan. Think of being abandoned by the Church, that august power in whose hands is lodged the fate of the human race, whose scepter stretches beyond the furthest constellation that twinkles in the sky. Whose authority is over millions that live and over the billions that wait trembling in purgatory for ransom or doom. Whose smile opens the gates of heaven to you, whose frown delivers you to the fires of everlasting hell, a power whose dominion overshadows and belittles the pomps and shows of a village. To be abandoned by one's king, yes, that is death, and death is much, but to be abandoned by Rome, to be abandoned by the Church. Ah, death is nothing to that, for that is consignment to endless life, and such a life. I could see the red waves tossing in that shoreless lake of fire, I could see the black myriads of the damned rise out of them and struggle and sink and rise again. And I knew that Joan was seeing what I saw, while she paused musing. And I believed that she must yield now, and in truth I hoped she would, for these men were able to make the threat good and deliver her over to eternal suffering. And I knew that it was in their natures to do it. But I was foolish to think that thought and hope that hope. Joan of Arc was not made as others are made. Fidelity to principle, fidelity to truth, fidelity to her word, all these were in her bone and in her flesh, they were parts of her. She could not change, she could not cast them out. She was the very genius of fidelity, she was steadfastness incarnated. Where she had taken her stand and planted her foot, there she would abide, hell itself could not move her from that place. Her voices had not given her permission to make the sort of submission that was required, therefore she would stand fast. She would wait, in perfect obedience, let come what might. My heart was like lead in my body when I went out from that dungeon, but she was serene, she was not troubled. She had done what she believed to be her duty, and that was sufficient. The consequences were not her affair. The last thing she said that time was full of this serenity, full of contented repose. I am a good Christian born and baptized, and a good Christian I will die. Chapter 15. Undaunted by threat of burning. 2 weeks went by. The 2nd of May was come, the chill was departed out of the air, the wild flowers were springing in the glades and glens, the birds were piping in the woods, all nature was brilliant with sunshine. All spirits were renewed and refreshed, all hearts glad, the world was alive with hope and cheer, the plain beyond the Seine stretched away soft and rich and green, the river was limpid and lovely. The leafy islands were dainty to see, and flung still daintier reflections of themselves upon the shining water. And from the tall bluffs above the bridge Rouen was become again a delight to the eye, the most exquisite and satisfying picture of a town that nestles under the arch of heaven anywhere. When I say that all hearts were glad and hopeful, I mean it in a general sense. There were exceptions, we who were the friends of Joan of Arc, also Joan of Arc herself, that poor girl shut up there in that frowning stretch of mighty walls and towers, brooding in darkness. So close to the flooding downpour of sunshine yet so impossibly far away from it. So longing for any little glimpse of it, yet so implacably denied it by those wolves in the black gowns who were plotting her death and the blackening of her good name. Cauchon was ready to go on with his miserable work. He had a new scheme to try now. He would see what persuasion could do, argument, eloquence, poured out upon the incorrigible captive from the mouth of a trained expert. That was his plan. But the reading of the 12 Articles to her was not a part of it. No, even Cauchon was ashamed to lay that monstrosity before her. Even he had a remnant of shame in him, away down deep, 1,000,000 fathoms deep, and that remnant asserted itself now and prevailed. On this fair 2nd of May, then, the Black Company gathered itself together in the spacious chamber at the end of the great hall of the castle, the Bishop of Beauvais on his throne. and 62 minor judges amassed before him, with the guards and recorders at their stations and the orator at his desk. Then we heard the far clank of chains, and presently Joan entered with her keepers and took her seat upon her isolated bench. She was looking well now, and most fair and beautiful after her fortnight's rest from wordy persecution. She glanced about and noted the orator. Doubtless she divined the situation. The orator had written his speech all out, and had it in his hand, though he held it back of him out of sight. It was so thick that it resembled a book. He began flowing, but in the midst of a flowery period his memory failed him and he had to snatch a furtive glance at his manuscript, which much injured the effect. Again this happened, and then a third time. The poor man's face was red with embarrassment, the whole great house was pitying him, which made the matter worse. Then Joan dropped in a remark which completed the trouble. She said, "Read your book, and then I will answer you." Why, it was almost cruel the way those mouldy veterans laughed. And as for the orator, he looked so flustered and helpless that almost anybody would have pitied him, and I had difficulty to keep from doing it myself. Yes, Joan was feeling very well after her rest, and the native mischief that was in her lay near the surface. It did not show when she made the remark, but I knew it was close in there back of the words. When the orator had gotten back his composure he did a wise thing. For he followed Joan's advice, he made no more attempts at sham impromptu oratory, but read his speech straight from his book. In the speech he compressed the 12 articles into 6, and made these his text. Every now and then he stopped and asked questions, and Joan replied. The nature of the church militant was explained, and once more Joan was asked to submit herself to it. She gave her usual answer. Then she was asked, "Do you believe the church can err?" "I believe it cannot err, but for those deeds and words of mine which were done and uttered by command of God, I will answer to him alone." "Will you say that you have no judge upon earth? Is not our Holy Father the Pope your judge?" "I will say nothing about it. I have a good master who is our Lord, and to him I will submit all." Then came these terrible words. "If you do not submit to the church you will be pronounced a heretic by these judges here present and burned at the stake." Ah, that would have smitten you or me dead with fright, but it only roused the lion heart of Joan of Arc. And in her answer rang that martial note which had used to stir her soldiers like a bugle call. "I will not say otherwise than I have said already. And if I saw the fire before me I would say it again." It was uplifting to hear her battle voice once more and see the battle light burn in her eye. Many there were stirred. Every man that was a man was stirred, whether friend or foe. And Mansion risked his life again, good soul, for he wrote in the margin of the record in good plain letters these brave words, "Superba responsio." And there they have remained these 60 years, and there you may read them to this day. Superba responsio. Yes, it was just that. For this superb answer came from the lips of a girl of 19 with death and hell staring her in the face. Of course, the matter of the male attire was gone over again. And as usual at wearisome length, also, as usual, the customary bribe was offered. If she would discard that dress voluntarily they would let her hear Mass. But she answered as she had often answered before. "I will go in a woman's robe to all services of the church if I may be permitted, but I will resume the other dress when I return to my cell." They set several traps for her in a tentative form. That is to say, they placed supposititious propositions before her and cunningly tried to commit her to one end of the propositions without committing themselves to the other. But she always saw the game and spoiled it. The trap was in this form. "Would you be willing to do so and so if we should give you leave?" Her answer was always in this form or to this effect. "When you give me leave, then you will know." Yes, Joan was at her best that 2nd of May. She had all her wits about her, and they could not catch her anywhere. It was a long, long session, and all the old ground was fought over again, foot by foot, and the orator expert worked all his persuasions, all his eloquence. But the result was the familiar one, a drawn battle, the 62 retiring upon their base, the solitary enemy holding her original position within her original lines. Chapter XVI. Joan stands defiant before the rack. The brilliant weather, the heavenly weather, the bewitching weather made everybody's heart to sing, as I have told you. Yes, Rouen was feeling light-hearted and gay, and most willing and ready to break out and laugh upon the least occasion. And so when the news went around that the young girl in the tower had scored another defeat against Bishop Cauchon, there was abundant laughter among the citizens of both parties. For they all hated the bishop. It is true, the English-hearted majority of the people wanted Joan burned, but that did not keep them from laughing at the man they hated. It would have been perilous for anybody to laugh at the English chiefs or at the majority of Cauchon's assistant judges. But to laugh at Cauchon or D'Estevette and Loiseleur was safe, nobody would report it. The difference between Cauchon and Cauchon VIII was not noticeable in speech, and so there was plenty of opportunity for puns. The opportunities were not thrown away. Some of the jokes got well worn in the course of 2 or 3 months, from repeated use, for every time Cauchon started a new trial the folk said, "The sow has littered 9 again." And every time the trial failed they said it over again, with its other meaning, "The hog has made a mess of it." And so, on the 3rd of May, Noel and I, drifting about the town, heard many a wide-mouthed lout let go his joke and his laugh, and then move to the next group, proud of his wit and happy to work it off again. Ods blood, the sow has littered 5 times, and 5 times has made a mess of it. And now and then one was bold enough to say, but he said it softly. 63 and the might of England against a girl, and she camps on the field 5 times. Cauchon lived in the great palace of the archbishop, and it was guarded by English soldiery. But no matter, there was never a dark night but the walls showed next morning that the rude joker had been there with his paint and brush. Yes, he had been there, and had smeared the sacred walls with pictures of hogs in all attitudes except flattering ones. Hogs clothed in a bishop's vestments and wearing a bishop's mitre irreverently cocked on the side of their heads. Cauchon raged and cursed over his defeats and his impotence during 7 says. Then he conceived a new scheme. You shall see what it was, for you have not cruel hearts, and you would never guess it. On the 9th of May there was a summons, and mansion, and I got out materials together and started. But this time we were to go to one of the other towers, not the one which was Joan's prison. It was round and grim and massive, and built of the plainest and thickest and solidest masonry, a dismal and forbidding structure. 10. We entered the circular room on the ground floor, and I saw what turned me sick, the instruments of torture and the executioners standing ready. Here you have the black heart of Cauchon at the blackest, here you have the proof that in his nature there was no such thing as pity. One wonders if he ever knew his mother or ever had a sister. Cauchon was there, and the vice-inquisitor and the abbot of Saint Corneille, also 6 others, among them that false Loiseleur. The guards were in their places, the rack was there, and by it stood the executioner and his aides in their crimson hose and doublets, meet color for their bloody trade. The picture of Joan rose before me stretched upon the rack, her feet tied to one end of it, her wrists to the other. And those red giants turning the windlass and pulling her limbs out of their sockets. It seemed to me that I could hear the bones snap and the flesh tear apart. And I did not see how that body of anointed servants of the merciful Jesus could sit there and look so placid and indifferent. After a little, Joan arrived and was brought in. She saw the rack, she saw the attendants, and the same picture which I had been seeing must have risen in her mind. But do you think she quailed, do you think she shuddered? No, there was no sign of that sort. She straightened herself up, and there was a slight curl of scorn about her lip. But as for fear, she showed not a vestige of it. This was a memorable session, but it was the shortest one of all the list. When Joan had taken her seat a resume of her crimes was read to her. Then Cauchon made a solemn speech. He said that in the course of her several trials Joan had refused to answer some of the questions and had answered others with lies, but that now he was going to have the truth out of her. And the whole of it. Her manner was full of confidence this time. He was sure he had found a way at last to break this child's stubborn spirit and make her beg and cry. He would score a victory this time and stop the mouths of the jokers of Rouen. You see, he was only just a man after all, and couldn't stand ridicule any better than other people. He talked high, and his splotchy face lighted itself up with all the shifting tints and signs of evil pleasure and promised triumph. Purple, yellow, red, green, they were all there. With sometimes the dull and spongy blue of a drowned man, the uncanniest of them all. And finally he burst out in a great passion and said, "There is the rack, and there are its ministers. You will reveal all now or be put to the torture. Speak." Then she made that great answer which will live forever, made it without fuss or bravado, and yet how fine and noble was the sound of it. "I will tell you nothing more than I have told you. No, not even if you tear the limbs from my body. And even if in my pain I did say something otherwise, would always say afterward that it was the torture that spoke and not I. There was no crushing that spirit. You should have seen Cauchon. Defeated again, and he had not dreamed of such a thing. I heard it said the next day, around the town, that he had a full confession all written out, in his pocket and all ready for Joan to sign. I do not know that that was true, but it probably was. For her mark signed at the bottom of a confession would be the kind of evidence, for effect with the public, which Cauchon and his people were particularly value, you know. No, there was no crushing that spirit, and no beclouding that clear mind. Consider the depth, the wisdom of that answer, coming from an ignorant girl. Why, there were not 6 men in the world who had ever reflected that words forced out of a person by horrible tortures were not necessarily words of verity and truth. Yet this unlettered peasant girl put her finger upon that flaw with an unerring instinct. I had always supposed that torture brought out the truth, everybody supposed it, and when Joan came out with those simple common-sense words they seemed to flood the place with light. It was like a lightning flash at midnight which suddenly reveals a fair valley sprinkled over with silver streams and gleaming villages and farmsteads where was only an impenetrable world of darkness. Before. Mansion stole a sidewise look at me, and his face was full of surprise, and there was the like to be seen in other faces there. Consider, they were old, and deeply cultured, yet here was a village made able to teach them something which they had not known before. I heard one of them mutter, "Verily it is a wonderful creature. She has laid her hand upon an accepted truth that is as old as the world, and it has crumbled to dust and rubbish under her touch. Now whence got she that marvelous insight?" The judges laid their heads together and began to talk now. It was plain, from chance words which one caught now and then, that Cauchon and Loiseleur were insisting upon the application of the torture, and that most of the others were urgently objecting. Finally Cauchon broke out with a good deal of asperity in his voice and ordered Joan back to her dungeon. That was a happy surprise for me. I was not expecting that the bishop would yield. When Mansion came home that night he said he had found out why the torture was not applied. There were 2 reasons. One was, a fear that Joan might die under the torture, which would not suit the English at all. The other was, that the torture would effect nothing if Joan was going to take back everything she said under its pains. And as to putting her mark to a confession, it was believed that not even the rack would ever make her do that. So all Rouen laughed again, and kept it up for 3 days, saying, "The sow has littered 6 times, and made 6 messes of it." And the palace walls got a new decoration, a mitred hog carrying a discarded rack home on its shoulder, and Loiseleur weeping in its wake. Many rewards were offered for the capture of these painters, but nobody applied. Even the English guard feigned blindness and would not see the artists at work. The bishop's anger was very high now. He could not reconcile himself to the idea of giving up the torture. It was the pleasantest idea he had invented yet, and he would not cast it by. So he called in some of his satellites on the 12th, and urged the torture again. But it was a failure. With some, Joan's speech had wrought an effect, others feared she might die under torture. Others did not believe that any amount of suffering could make her put her mark to a lying confession. There were 14 men present, including the bishop. 11 of them voted dead against the torture, and stood their ground in spite of Cauchon's abuse. 2 voted with the bishop and insisted upon the torture. These 2 were Loiseleur and the orator, the man whom Joan had bidden to read his book, Thomas de Courcelles, the renowned pleader and master of eloquence. Age has taught me charity of speech. But it fails me when I think of those 3 names, Cauchon, Courcelles, Loiseleur. Chapter 17. Supreme in direst peril. Another 10 days' wait. The great theologians of that treasury of all valuable knowledge and all wisdom, the University of Paris, were still weighing and considering and discussing the 12 lies. I had but little to do these 10 days, so I spent them mainly in walks about the town with Noël. But there was no pleasure in them, our spirits being so burdened with cares, and the outlook for Joan growing steadily darker and darker all the time. And then we naturally contrasted our circumstances with hers, this freedom and sunshine, with her darkness and chains, our comradeship, with her lonely estate. Our alleviations of one sort and another, with her destitution in all. She was used to liberty, but now she had none. She was an out-of-door creature by nature and habit, but now she was shut up day and night in a steel cage like an animal. She was used to the light, but now she was always in a gloom where all objects about her were dim and spectral. She was used to the 1,000 various sounds which are the cheer and music of a busy life, but now she heard only the monotonous footfall of the sentry pacing his watch. She had been fond of talking with her mates, but now there was no one to talk to. She had had an easy laugh, but it was gone dumb now. She had been born for comradeship, and blithe and busy work, and all manner of joyous activities, but here were only dreariness, and leaden hours, and weary inaction, and brooding stillness. And thoughts that travel by day and night and day round and round in the same circle, and wear the brain and break the heart with weariness. It was death in life, yes, death in life, that is what it must have been. And there was another hard thing about it all. A young girl in trouble needs the soothing solace and support and sympathy of persons of her own sex, and the delicate offices and gentle ministries which only these can furnish. Yet in all these months of gloomy captivity in her dungeon Joan never saw the face of a girl or a woman. Think how her heart would have leaped to see such a face. Consider. If you would realize how great Joan of Arc was. Remember that it was out of such a place and such circumstances that she came week after week and month after month and confronted the master intellects of France single-handed. And baffled their cunningest schemes, defeated their ablest plans, detected and avoided their secretest traps and pitfalls, broke their lines, repelled their assaults. And camped on the field after every engagement. Steadfast always, true to her faith and her ideals. Defying torture, defying the stake, and answering threats of eternal death and the pains of hell with a simple, let come what may, here I take my stand and will abide. Yes, if you would realize how great was the soul, how profound the wisdom, and how luminous the intellect of Joan of Arc, you must study her there. Where she fought out that long fight all alone, and not merely against the subtlest brains and deepest learning of France, but against the ignoble deceits, the meanest treacheries. And the hardest hearts to be found in any land, pagan or Christian. She was great in battle, we all know that, great in foresight, great in loyalty and patriotism, great in persuading discontented chiefs and reconciling conflicting interests and passions. Great in the ability to discover merit and genius wherever it lay hidden, great in picturesque and eloquent speech. Supremely great in the gift of firing the hearts of hopeless men and noble enthusiasms, the gift of turning hares into heroes. Slaves and skulkers into battalions that march to death with songs on their lips. But all these are exalting activities, they keep hand and heart and brain keyed up to their work. There is the joy of achievement, the inspiration of stir and movement, the applause which hails success, the soul is overflowing with life and energy, the faculties are at white heat. Weariness, despondency, inertia, these do not exist. Yes, Joan of Arc was great always, great everywhere, but she was greatest in the Rouen trials. There she rose above the limitations and infirmities of our human nature, and accomplished under blighting and unnerving and hopeless conditions all that her splendid equipment of moral and intellectual forces could have accomplished if they had been supplemented by the mighty helps of hope and cheer and light. The presence of friendly faces, and a fair and equal fight, with the great world looking on and wondering. Chapter 18. Condemned yet unafraid. Toward the end of the 10-day interval the University of Paris rendered its decision concerning the 12 articles. By this finding, Joan was guilty upon all the counts, she must renounce her errors and make satisfaction, or be abandoned to the secular arm for punishment. The University's mind was probably already made up before the articles were laid before it, yet it took it from the 5th to the 18th to produce its verdict. I think the delay may have been caused by temporary difficulties concerning 2 points. As to who the fiends were who were represented in Joan's voices. As to whether her saints spoke French only. You understand, the University decided emphatically that it was fiends who spoke in those voices. It would need to prove that, and it did. It found out who those fiends were, and named them in the verdict: Belial, Satan, and Behemoth. This has always seemed a doubtful thing to me, and not entitled to much credit. I think so for this reason: if the University had actually known it was those 3, it would for very consistency's sake have told how it knew it, and not stopped with the mere assertion. Since it had made Joan explain how she knew they were not fiends. Does not that seem reasonable? To my mind the University's position was weak, and I will tell you why. It had claimed that Joan's angels were devils in disguise, and we all know that devils do disguise themselves as angels. Up to that point the University's position was strong. But you see yourself that it eats its own argument when it turns around and pretends that it can tell who such apparitions are. While denying the like ability to a person with as good a head on her shoulders as the best one the University could produce. The doctors of the University had to see those creatures in order to know. And if Joan was deceived, it is argument that they in their turn could also be deceived, for their insight and judgment were surely not clearer than hers. As to the other point which I have thought may have proved a difficulty and cost the University delay, I will touch but a moment upon that, and pass on. The University decided that it was blasphemy for Joan to say that her saints spoke French and not English, and were on the French side in political sympathies. I think that the thing which troubled the doctors of theology was this: they had decided that the 3 voices were Satan and 2 other devils. But they had also decided that these voices were not on the French side, thereby tacitly asserting that they were on the English side. And if on the English side, then they must be angels and not devils. Otherwise, the situation was embarrassing. You see, the University being the wisest and deepest and most erudite body in the world, it would like to be logical if it could, for the sake of its reputation. Therefore it would study and study, days and days, trying to find some good common-sense reason for proving the voices to be devils in Article number 1 and proving them to be angels in Article number 10. However, they had to give it up. They found no way out, and so, to this day, the University's verdict remains just so: devils in number 1, angels in number 10, and no way to reconcile the discrepancy. The envoys brought the verdict to Rouen, and with it a letter for Cauchon which was full of fervid praise. The University complimented him on his zeal in hunting down this woman whose venom had infected the faithful of the whole West. And as recompense it as good as promised him a crown of imperishable glory in heaven. Only that, a crown in heaven, a promissory note and no endorser, always something away off yonder. Not a word about the Archbishopric of Rouen, which was the thing Cauchon was destroying his soul for. A crown in heaven, it must have sounded like a sarcasm to him, after all his hard work. What should he do in heaven? He did not know anybody there. On the 19th of May a court of 50 judges sat in the archiepiscopal palace to discuss Joan's fate. A few wanted her delivered over to the secular arm at once for punishment, but the rest insisted that she be once more charitably admonished first. So the same court met in the castle on the 23rd, and Joan was brought to the bar. Pierre Maurice, a canon of Rouen, made a speech to Joan in which he admonished her to save her life and her soul by renouncing her errors and surrendering to the Church. He finished with a stern threat: if she remained obstinate, the damnation of her soul was certain, the destruction of her body probable. But Joan was immovable. She said, "If I were under sentence, and saw the fire before me, and the executioner ready to light it, more, if I were in the fire itself, I would say none but the things which I have said in these trials. And I would abide by them till I died." A deep silence followed now, which endured some moments. It lay upon me like a weight. I knew it for an omen. Then Cauchon, grave and solemn, turned to Pierre Maurice. "Have you anything further to say?" The priest bowed low, and said, "Nothing, my lord." "Prisoner at the bar, have you anything further to say?" "Nothing." "Then the debate is closed. Tomorrow, sentence will be pronounced. Remove the prisoner." She seemed to go from the place erect and noble. But I do not know, my sight was dim with tears. Tomorrow, 24th of May. Exactly a year since I saw her go speeding across the plain at the head of her troops, her silver helmet shining, her silvery cape fluttering in the wind, her white plumes flowing, her sword held aloft. Saw her charge the Burgundian camp 3 times, and carry it, saw her will to the right and spur for the Duke's reserves, saw her fling herself against it in the last assault she was ever to make. And now that fatal day was come again, and see what it was bringing. Chapter 19. Our last hopes of rescue fail. Joan had been adjudged guilty of heresy, sorcery, and all the other terrible crimes set forth in the 12 Articles, and her life was in Cauchon's hands at last. He could send her to the stake at once. His work was finished now, you think? He was satisfied? Not at all. What would his archbishopric be worth if the people should get the idea into their heads that this faction of interested priests, slaving under the English lash, had wrongly condemned and burned Joan of Arc, deliverer of France? That would be to make of her a holy martyr. Then her spirit would rise from her body's ashes, 1,000-fold reinforced, and sweep the English domination into the sea, and Cauchon along with it. No, the victory was not complete yet. Joan's guilt must be established by evidence which would satisfy the people. Where was that evidence to be found? There was only one person in the world who could furnish it, Joan of Arc herself. She must condemn herself, and in public, at least she must seem to do it. But how was this to be managed? Weeks had been spent already in trying to get her to surrender, time wholly wasted. What was to persuade her now? Torture had been threatened, the fire had been threatened, what was left? Illness, deadly fatigue, and the sight of the fire, the presence of the fire. That was left. Now that was a shrewd thought. She was but a girl after all, and, under illness and exhaustion, subject to a girl's weaknesses. Yes, it was shrewdly thought. She had tacitly said herself that under the bitter pains of the rack they would be able to extort a false confession from her. It was a hint worth remembering, and it was remembered. She had furnished another hint at the same time, that as soon as the pains were gone, she would retract the confession. That hint was also remembered. She had herself taught them what to do, you see. First, they must wear out her strength, then frighten her with the fire. Second, while the fright was on her, she must be made to sign a paper. But she would demand a reading of the paper. They could not venture to refuse this, with the public there to hear. Suppose that during the reading her courage should return? She would refuse to sign then. Very well, even that difficulty could be got over. They could read a short paper of no importance, then slip a long and deadly one into its place and trick her into signing that. Yet there was still one other difficulty. If they made her seem to abjure, that would free her from the death penalty. They could keep her in a prison of the church, but they could not kill her. That would not answer. For only her death would content the English. Alive she was a terror, in a prison or out of it. She had escaped from 2 prisons already. But even that difficulty could be managed. Cauchon would make promises to her, in return she would promise to leave off the male dress. He would violate his promises, and that would so situate her that she would not be able to keep hers. Her lapse would condemn her to the stake, and the stake would be ready. These were the several moves, there was nothing to do but to make them, each in its order, and the game was won. One might almost name the day that the betrayed girl, the most innocent creature in France and the noblest, would go to her pitiful death. And the time was favorable, cruelly favorable. Joan's spirit had as yet suffered no decay, it was as sublime and masterful as ever. But her body's forces had been steadily wasting away in those last 10 days, and a strong mind needs a healthy body for its rightful support. The world knows now that Cauchon's plan was as I have sketched it to you, but the world did not know it at that time. There are sufficient indications that Warwick and all the other English chiefs except the highest one, the Cardinal of Winchester, were not let into the secret, also. That only Loiseleur and Beaupère, on the French side, knew the scheme. Sometimes I have doubted if even Loiseleur and Beaupère knew the whole of it at first. However, if any did, it was these 2. It is usual to let the condemned pass their last night of life in peace, but this grace was denied to poor Joan, if one may credit the rumors of the time. Loiseleur was smuggled into her presence, and in the character of priest, friend, and secret partisan of France and hater of England. He spent some hours in beseeching her to do, the only right and righteous thing, submit to the Church, as a good Christian should. And that then she would straightway get out of the clutches of the dreaded English and be transferred to the Church's prison, where she would be honorably used and have women about her for jailers. He knew where to touch her. He knew how odious to her was the presence of her rough and profane English guards. He knew that her voices had vaguely promised something which she interpreted to be escape, rescue, release of some sort. And the chance to burst upon France once more and victoriously complete the great work which she had been commissioned of heaven to do. Also there was that other thing, if her failing body could be further weakened by loss of rest and sleep now, her tired mind would be dazed and drowsy on the morrow. And in ill condition to stand out against persuasions, threats, and the sight of the stake, and also be purblind to traps and snares which it would be swift to detect when in its normal estate. I do not need to tell you that there was no rest for me that night. Nor for Noel. We went to the main gate of the city before nightfall, with a hope in our minds, based upon that vague prophecy of Joan's voices which seemed to promise a rescue by force at the last moment. The immense news had flown swiftly far and wide that at last Joan of Arc was condemned, and would be sentenced and burned alive on the morrow. And so crowds of people were flowing in at the gate, and other crowds were being refused admission by the soldiery, these being people who brought doubtful passes or none at all. We scanned these crowds eagerly, but there was nothing about them to indicate that they were our old war comrades in disguise, and certainly there were no familiar faces among them. And so, when the gate was closed at last, we turned away grieved, and more disappointed than we cared to admit, either in speech or thought. The streets were surging tides of excited men. It was difficult to make one's way. Toward midnight our aimless tramp brought us to the neighborhood of the beautiful church of St. Ouen, and there all was bustle and work. The square was a wilderness of torches and people. And through a guarded passage dividing the pack, laborers were carrying planks and timbers and disappearing with them through the gate of the churchyard. We asked what was going forward. The answer was scaffolds and the stake. Don't you know that the French witch is to be burned in the morning? Then we went away. We had no heart for that place. At dawn we were at the city gate again, this time with a hope which our wearied bodies and fevered minds magnified into a large probability. We had heard a report that the abbot of Jumiages with all his monks was coming to witness the burning. Our desire, abetted by our imagination, turned those 900 monks into Joan's old campaigners, and their abbot into La Hire or the Bastard or d'Alençon. And we watched them file in, unchallenged, the multitude respectfully dividing and uncovering while they passed. With our hearts in our throats and our eyes swimming with tears of joy and pride and exultation. And we tried to catch glimpses of the faces under the cowls. And were prepared to give signal to any recognized face that we were Joan's men and ready and eager to kill and be killed in the good cause. How foolish we were, but we were young, you know, and youth hopeth all things, believeth all things. Chapter 20. The Betrayal. In the morning I was at my official post. It was on a platform raised the height of a man, in the churchyard, under the eaves of St. Ouen. On this same platform was a crowd of priests and important citizens, and several lawyers. Abreast it, with a small space between, was another and larger platform, handsomely canopied against sun and rain, and richly carpeted. Also it was furnished with comfortable chairs, and with two which were more sumptuous than the others, and raised above the general level. One of these two was occupied by a prince of the royal blood of England, His Eminence the Cardinal of Winchester, the other by Cauchon, Bishop of Beauvais. In the rest of the chairs sat 3 bishops, the vice-inquisitor, 8 abbots, and the 62 friars and lawyers who had sat as Joan's judges in her late trials. 20 steps in front of the platforms was another, a table-topped pyramid of stone, built up in retreating courses, thus forming steps. Out of this rose that grisly thing, the stake. About the stake bundles of faggots and firewood were piled. On the ground at the base of the pyramid stood 3 crimson figures, the executioner and his assistants. At their feet lay what had been a goodly heap of brands, but was now a smokeless nest of ruddy coals. A foot or 2 from this was a supplemental supply of wood and faggots compacted into a pile shoulder-high and containing as much as 6 packhorse loads. Think of that. We seem so delicately made, so destructible, so insubstantial, yet it is easier to reduce a granite statue to ashes than it is to do that with a man's body. The sight of the stake sent physical pains tingling down the nerves of my body. And yet, turn as I would, my eyes would keep coming back to it, such fascination has the gruesome and the terrible for us. The space occupied by the platforms and the stake was kept open by a wall of English soldiery, standing elbow to elbow, erect and stalwart figures, fine and sightly in their polished steel. While from behind them on every hand stretched far away a level plain of human heads. And there was no window and no housetop within our view, howsoever distant, but was black with patches and masses of people. But there was no noise, no stir, it was as if the world was dead. The impressiveness of this silence and solemnity was deepened by a leaden twilight, for the sky was hidden by a pall of low-hanging storm clouds. And above the remote horizon faint winkings of heat lightning played, and now and then one caught the dull mutterings and complainings of distant thunder. At last the stillness was broken. From beyond the square rose an indistinct sound, but familiar, court, crisp phrases of command. Next I saw the plain of heads dividing, and the steady swing of a marching host was glimpsed between. My heart leaped for a moment. Was it La Hire and his hellions? No, that was not their gait. No, it was the prisoner and her escort, it was Joan of Arc, under guard, that was coming. My spirits sank as low as they had been before. Weak as she was they made her walk, they would increase her weakness all they could. The distance was not great, it was but a few hundred yards, but short as it was a heavy tax upon one who had been lying chained in one spot for months. And whose feet had lost their powers from inaction. Yes, and for a year Joan had known only the cool damps of a dungeon, and now she was dragging herself through this sultry summer heat, this airless and suffocating void. As she entered the gate, drooping with exhaustion, there was that creature Loiseleur at her side with his head bent to her ear. We knew afterward that he had been with her again this morning in the prison, wearying her with his persuasions and enticing her with false promises. And that he was now still at the same work at the gate, imploring her to yield everything that would be required of her. And assuring her that if she would do this all would be well with her, she would be rid of the dreaded English and find safety in the powerful shelter and protection of the Church. A miserable man, a stony-hearted man. The moment Joan was seated on the platform she closed her eyes and allowed her chin to fall. And so sat, with her hands nestling in her lap, indifferent to everything, caring for nothing but rest. And she was so white again, white as alabaster. How the faces of that packed mass of humanity lighted up with interest, and with what intensity all eyes gazed upon this fragile girl. And how natural it was. For these people realized that at last they were looking upon that person whom they had so long hungered to see. A person whose name and fame filled all Europe, and made all other names and all other renowns insignificant by comparisons. Joan of Arc, the wonder of the time, and destined to be the wonder of all times. And I could read as by print, in their marveling countenances, the words that were drifting through their minds: can it be true, is it believable, that it is this little creature, this girl? This child with the good face, the sweet face, the beautiful face, the dear and bonny face, that has carried fortresses by storm, charged at the head of victorious armies, blown the might of England out of her path with a breath, and fought a long campaign, solitary and alone, against the massed brains and learning of France, and had won it if the fight had been fair. Evidently Cauchon had grown afraid of Mansion because of his pretty apparent leanings toward Joan, for another recorder was in the chief place here. Which left my master and me nothing to do but sit idle and look on. Well, I suppose that everything had been done which could be thought of to tire Joan's body and mind, but it was a mistake. One more device had been invented. This was to preach a long sermon to her in that oppressive heat. When the preacher began, she cast up one distressed and disappointed look, then dropped her head again. This preacher was Guillaume Erard, an oratorical celebrity. He got his text from the 12 Lies. He emptied upon Joan all the calumnies in detail that had been bottled up in that mass of venom, and called her all the brutal names that the 12 were labeled with, working himself into a whirlwind of fury as he went on. But his labors were wasted. She seemed lost in dreams, she made no sign, she did not seem to hear. At last he launched this apostrophe. O France, how hast thou been abused! Thou hast always been the home of Christianity. But now, Charles, who calls himself thy king and governor, endorses, like the heretic and schismatic that he is, the words and deeds of a worthless and infamous woman. Joan raised her head, and her eyes began to burn and flash. The preacher turned to her. It is to you, Joan, that I speak, and I tell you that your king is schismatic and a heretic. Ah, he might abuse her to his heart's content, she could endure that. But to her dying moment she could never hear in patience a word against that ingrate, that treacherous dog our king, whose proper place was here, at this moment, sword in hand, routing these reptiles and saving this most noble servant that ever king had in this world, and he would have been there if he had not been what I have called him. Joan's loyal soul was outraged. And she turned upon the preacher and flung out a few words with a spirit which the crowd recognized as being in accordance with the Joan of Arc traditions. By my faith, sir, I make bold to say and swear, on pain of death, that he is the most noble Christian of all Christians, and the best lover of the faith and the church. There was an explosion of applause from the crowd, which angered the preacher, for he had been aching long to hear an expression like this. And now that it was come at last it had fallen to the wrong person, he had done all the work. The other had carried off all the spoil. He stamped his foot and shouted to the sheriff. Make her shut up. That made the crowd laugh. A mob has small respect for a grown man who has to call on a sheriff to protect him from a sick girl. Joan had damaged the preacher's cause more with one sentence than he had helped it with 100, so he was much put out, and had trouble to get a good start again. But he needn't have bothered. There was no occasion. It was mainly an English-feeling mob. It had but obeyed a law of our nature, an irresistible law, to enjoy and applaud a spirited and promptly delivered retort, no matter who makes it. The mob was with the preacher. It had been beguiled for a moment, but only that, it would soon return. It was there to see this girl burnt, so that it got that satisfaction, without too much delay, it would be content. Presently the preacher formally summoned Joan to submit to the church. He made the demand with confidence, for he had gotten the idea from Loiseleur and Beaupère that she was worn to the bone, exhausted, and would not be able to put forth any more resistance. And, indeed, to look at her it seemed that they must be right. Nevertheless, she made one more effort to hold her ground, and said, wearily, "As to that matter, I have answered my judges before. I have told them to report all that I have said and done to our Holy Father the Pope, to whom, and to God first, I appeal." Again, out of her native wisdom, she had brought those words of tremendous import, but was ignorant of their value. But they could have availed her nothing in any case, now, with the stake there and these thousands of enemies about her. Yet they made every churchman their blench, and the preacher changed the subject with all haste. Well might those criminals blench, for Joan's appeal of her case to the Pope stripped Cauchon at once of jurisdiction over it, and annulled all that he and his judges had already done in the matter and all that they should do in it henceforth. Joan went on presently to reiterate, after some further talk, that she had acted by command of God in her deeds and utterances. Then, when an attempt was made to implicate the king, and friends of hers and his, she stopped that. She said, "I charge my deeds and words upon no one, neither upon my king nor any other. If there is any fault in them, I am responsible and no other." She was asked if she would not recant those of her words and deeds which had been pronounced evil by her judges. Here answer made confusion and damage again. "I submit them to God and the Pope." The Pope once more. It was very embarrassing. Here was a person who was asked to submit her case to the church, and who frankly consents, offers to submit it to the very head of it. What more could anyone require? How was one to answer such a formidably unanswerable answer as that? The worried judges put their heads together and whispered and planned and discussed. Then they brought forth this sufficiently shambling conclusion, but it was the best they could do, in so close a place. They said the Pope was so far away. And it was not necessary to go to him anyway, because the present judges had sufficient power and authority to deal with the present case, and were in effect, the Church, to that extent. At another time they could have smiled at this conceit, but not now. They were not comfortable enough now. The mob was getting impatient. It was beginning to put on a threatening aspect. It was tired of standing, tired of the scorching heat, and the thunder was coming nearer, the lightning was flashing brighter. It was necessary to hurry this matter to a close. Erard showed Joan a written form, which had been prepared and made all ready beforehand, and asked her to abjure. Abjure? What is abjure? She did not know the word. It was explained to her by Massou. She tried to understand, but she was breaking, under exhaustion, and she could not gather the meaning. It was all a jumble and confusion of strange words. In her despair she sent out this beseeching cry. "I appeal to the Church Universal whether I ought to abjure or not." Erard exclaimed, "You shall abjure instantly, or instantly be burnt." She glanced up, at those awful words, and for the first time she saw the stake and the mass of red coals, redder and angrier than ever now under the constantly deepening storm gloom. She gasped and staggered up out of her seat muttering and mumbling incoherently, and gazed vacantly upon the people and the scene about her like one who is dazed, or thinks he dreams, and does not know where he is. The priests crowded about her imploring her to sign the paper. There were many voices beseeching and urging her at once. There was great turmoil and shouting and excitement among the populace and everywhere. "Sign! Sign," from the priests, "sign, sign and be saved." And Loiseleur was urging at her ear, "Do as I told you, do not destroy yourself." Joan said plaintively to these people, "Ah, you do not do well to seduce me." The judges joined their voices to the others. Yes, even the iron in their hearts melted, and they said, "Oh Joan, we pity you so. Take back what you have said, or we must deliver you up to punishment." And now there was another voice, it was from the other platform, pealing solemnly above the din, Cauchon's, reading the sentence of death. Joan's strength was all spent. She stood looking about her in a bewildered way a moment, then slowly she sank to her knees, and bowed her head and said, "I submit." They gave her no time to reconsider, they knew the peril of that. The moment the words were out of her mouth, Massou was reading to her the abjuration, and she was repeating the words after him mechanically, unconsciously, and smiling. For her wandering mind was far away in some happier world. Then this short paper of 6 lines was slipped aside and a long one of many pages was smuggled into its place, and she, noting nothing, put her mark on it, saying, in pathetic apology, that she did not know how to write. But a secretary of the King of England was there to take care of that defect. He guided her hand with his own, and wrote her name, Jehan. The great crime was accomplished. She had signed, what? She did not know, but the others knew. She had signed a paper confessing herself a sorceress, a dealer with devils, a liar, a blasphemer of God and his angels, a lover of blood, a promoter of sedition, cruel, wicked, commissioned of Satan. And this signature of hers bound her to resume the dress of a woman. There were other promises, but that one would answer, without the others, and that one could be made to destroy her. Loiseleur pressed forward and praised her for having done such a good day's work. But she was still dreamy, she hardly heard. Then Cauchon pronounced the words which dissolved the excommunication and restored her to her beloved church, with all the dear privileges of worship. Ah, she heard that. You could see it in the deep gratitude that rose in her face and transfigured it with joy. But how transient was that happiness! For Cauchon, without a tremor of pity in his voice, added these crushing words. And that she may repent of her crimes and repeat them no more, she is sentenced to perpetual imprisonment. With the bread of affliction and the water of anguish. Perpetual imprisonment. She had never dreamed of that, such a thing had never been hinted to her by Loiseleur or by any other. Loiseleur had distinctly said and promised that all would be well with her. And the very last words spoken to her by Erard, on that very platform, when he was urging her to abjure, was a straight, unqualified promise, that if she would do it she should go free from captivity. She stood stunned and speechless a moment. Then she remembered, with such solacement as the thought could furnish, that by another clear promise made by Cauchon himself, she would at least be the Church's captive, and have women about her in place of a brutal foreign soldiery. So she turned to the body of priests and said, with a sad resignation, "Now, you men of the Church, take me to your prison, and leave me no longer in the hands of the English." And she gathered up her chains and prepared to move. But alas! Now came these shameful words from Cauchon, and with them a mocking laugh. Take her to the prison whence she came. Poor abused girl! She stood dumb, smitten, paralyzed. It was pitiful to see. She had been beguiled, lied to, betrayed, she saw it all now. The rumbling of a drum broke upon the stillness, and for just one moment she thought of the glorious deliverance promised by her voices. I read it in the rapture that lit her face. Then she saw what it was, her prison escort, and that light faded, never to revive again. And now her head began a piteous rocking motion, swaying slowly, this way and that, as is the way when one is suffering unwordable pain, or when one's heart is broken. Then drearily she went from us, with her face in her hands, and sobbing bitterly. Chapter 21. Respite only for torture. There is no certainty that anyone in all Rouen was in the secret of the deep game which Cauchon was playing except the Cardinal of Winchester. Then you can imagine the astonishment and stupefaction of that vast mob gathered there and those crowds of churchmen assembled on the 2 platforms, when they saw Joan of Arc moving away. Alive and whole, slipping out of their grip at last, after all this tedious waiting, all this tantalizing expectancy. Nobody was able to stir or speak for a while, so paralyzing was the universal astonishment, so unbelievable the fact that the stake was actually standing there unoccupied and its prey gone. Then suddenly everybody broke into a fury of rage, maledictions and charges of treachery began to fly freely. Yes, and even stones. A stone came near killing the Cardinal of Winchester, it just missed his head. But the man who threw it was not to blame, for he was excited, and a person who is excited never can throw straight. The tumult was very great, indeed, for a while. In the midst of it a chaplain of the cardinal even forgot the proprieties so far as to opprobriously assail the august Bishop of Beauvais himself, shaking his fist in his face and shouting, "By God! You are a traitor!" "You lie," responded the bishop. "He a traitor? Oh, far from it, he certainly was the last Frenchman that any Briton had a right to bring that charge against." The Earl of Warwick lost his temper, too. He was a doughty soldier, but when it came to the intellectuals, when it came to delicate chicane, and scheming, and trickery, he couldn't see any further through a millstone than another. So he burst out in his frank warrior fashion, and swore that the King of England was being treacherously used, and that Joan of Arc was going to be allowed to cheat the stake. But they whispered comfort into his ear. "Give yourself no uneasiness, my lord, we shall soon have her again." Perhaps the like tidings found their way all around, for good news travels fast as well as bad. At any rate, the ragings presently quieted down, and the huge concourse crumbled apart and disappeared. And thus we reached the noon of that fearful Thursday. We two youths were happy. Happier than any words can tell, for we were not in the secret any more than the rest. Joan's life was saved. We knew that, and that was enough. France would hear of this day's infamous work, and then? Why, then her gallant sons would flock to her standard by thousands and thousands, multitudes upon multitudes, and their wrath would be like the wrath of the ocean when the storm winds sweep it. And they would hurl themselves against this doomed city and overwhelm it like the resistless tides of that ocean, and Joan of Arc would march again. In 6 days, 7 days, 1 short week, noble France, grateful France, indignant France, would be thundering at these gates. Let us count the hours, let us count the minutes. Let us count the seconds. Oh happy day, oh day of ecstasy, how our hearts sang in our bosoms. For we were young then, yes, we were very young. Do you think the exhausted prisoner was allowed to rest and sleep after she had spent the small remnant of her strength in dragging her tired body back to the dungeon? No, there was no rest for her, with those sleuth-hounds on her track. Cauchon and some of his people followed her to her lair straightway. They found her dazed and dull, her mental and physical forces in a state of prostration. They told her she had abjured. That she had made certain promises, among them, to resume the apparel of her sex, and that if she relapsed, the church would cast her out for good and all. She heard the words, but they had no meaning to her. She was like a person who has taken a narcotic and is dying for sleep, dying for rest from nagging, dying to be let alone, and who mechanically does everything the persecutor asks. Taking but dull note of the things done, and but dully recording them in the memory. And so Joan put on the gown which Cauchon and his people had brought, and would come to herself by and by, and have at first but a dim idea as to when and how the change had come about. Cauchon went away happy and content. Joan had resumed woman's dress without protest, also she had been formally warned against relapsing. He had witnesses to these facts. How could matters be better? But suppose she should not relapse? Why, then she must be forced to do it. Did Cauchon hint to the English guards that thenceforth if they chose to make their prisoner's captivity crueler and bitterer than ever, no official notice would be taken of it? Perhaps so. Since the guards did begin that policy at once, and no official notice was taken of it. Yes, from that moment Joan's life in that dungeon was made almost unendurable. Do not ask me to enlarge upon it. I will not do it. Chapter 22. Joan gives the fatal answer. Friday and Saturday were happy days for Noel and me. Our minds were full of our splendid dream of France aroused, France shaking her mane, France on the march, France at the gates, Rouen in ashes, and Joan free. Our imagination was on fire. We were delirious with pride and joy. For we were very young, as I have said. We knew nothing about what had been happening in the dungeon in the yester afternoon. We supposed that as Joan had abjured and been taken back into the forgiving bosom of the church, she was being gently used now. And her captivity made as pleasant and comfortable for her as the circumstances would allow. So, in high contentment, we planned out our share in the great rescue, and fought our part of the fight over and over again during those 2 happy days, as happy days as ever I have known. Sunday morning came. I was awake, enjoying the balmy, lazy weather, and thinking. Thinking of the rescue, what else? I had no other thought now. I was absorbed in that, drunk with the happiness of it. I heard a voice shouting far down the street, and soon it came nearer, and I caught the words. Joan of Arc has relapsed. The witch's time has come. It stopped my heart, it turned my blood to ice. That was more than 60 years ago, but that triumphant note rings as clear in my memory today as it rang in my ear that long-vanished summer morning. We are so strangely made. The memories that could make us happy pass away, it is the memories that break our hearts that abide. Soon other voices took up that cry, tens, scores, hundreds of voices. All the world seemed filled with the brutal joy of it. And there were other clamors, the clatter of rushing feet, merry congratulations, bursts of coarse laughter, the rolling of drums. The boom and crash of distant bands profaning the sacred day with the music of victory and thanksgiving. About the middle of the afternoon came a summons for Mansion and me to go to Joan's dungeon, a summons from Cauchon. But by that time distrust had already taken possession of the English and their soldiery again, and all Rouen was in an angry and threatening mood. We could see plenty of evidences of this from our own windows, fist-shaking, black looks, tumultuous tides of furious men billowing by along the street. And we learned that up at the castle things were going very badly, indeed. That there was a great mob gathered there who considered the relapse a lie and a priestly trick, and among them many half-drunk English soldiers. Moreover, these people had gone beyond words. They had laid hands upon a number of churchmen who were trying to enter the castle, and it had been difficult work to rescue them and save their lives. And so Mansion refused to go. He said he would not go a step without a safeguard from Warwick. So next morning Warwick sent an escort of soldiers, and then we went. Matters had not grown peacefuler meantime, but worse. The soldiers protected us from bodily damage, but as we passed through the great mob at the castle we were assailed with insults and shameful epithets. I bore it well enough, though, and said to myself, with secret satisfaction, in 3 or 4 short days, my lads, you will be employing your tongues in a different sort from this, and I shall be there to hear. To my mind these were as good as dead men. How many of them would still be alive after the rescue that was coming? Not more than enough to amuse the executioner a short half-hour, certainly. It turned out that the report was true. Joan had relapsed. She was sitting there in her chains, clothed again in her male attire. She accused nobody. That was her way. It was not in her character to hold a servant to account for what his master had made him do, and her mind had cleared now. And she knew that the advantage which had been taken of her the previous morning had its origin, not in the subordinate but in the master, Cauchon. Here is what had happened. While Joan slept, in the early morning of Sunday, one of the guards stole her female apparel and put her male attire in its place. When she woke she asked for the other dress, but the guards refused to give it back. She protested, and said she was forbidden to wear the male dress. But they continued to refuse. She had to have clothing, for modesty's sake. Moreover, she saw that she could not save her life if she must fight for it against treacheries like this. So she put on the forbidden garments, knowing what the end would be. She was weary of the struggle, poor thing. We had followed in the wake of Cauchon, the vice-inquisitor, and the others, 6 or 8, and when I saw Joan sitting there, despondent, forlorn, and still in chains. When I was expecting to find her situation so different, I did not know what to make of it. The shock was very great. I had doubted the relapse perhaps, possibly I had believed in it, but had not realized it. Cauchon's victory was complete. He had had a harassed and irritated and disgusted look for a long time, but that was all gone now, and contentment and serenity had taken its place. His purple face was full of tranquil and malicious happiness. He went trailing his robes and stood grandly in front of Joan, with his legs apart, and remained so more than a minute, gloating over her and enjoying the sight of this poor ruined creature, who had won so lofty a place for him in the service of the meek and merciful Jesus, Saviour of the world, Lord of the universe, in case England kept her promise to him, who kept no promises himself. Presently the judges began to question Joan. One of them, named Marguerite, who was a man with more insight than prudence, remarked upon Joan's change of clothing, and said, "There is something suspicious about this. How could it have come about without connivance on the part of others? Perhaps even something worse?" "Thousand devils," screamed Cauchon, in a fury. "Will you shut your mouth? Armagnac!" "Traitor!" shouted the soldiers on guard, and made a rush for Marguerite with their lances leveled. It was with the greatest difficulty that he was saved from being run through the body. He made no more attempts to help the inquiry, poor man. The other judges proceeded with the questionings. "Why have you resumed this male habit?" I did not quite catch her answer, for just then a soldier's halberd slipped from his fingers and fell on the stone floor with a crash. But I thought I understood Joan to say that she had resumed it of her own motion. "But you have promised and sworn that you would not go back to it." I was full of anxiety to hear her answer to that question, and when it came it was just what I was expecting. She said, quietly, "I have never intended and never understood myself to swear I would not resume it." There, I had been sure, all along, that she did not know what she was doing and saying on the platform Thursday, and this answer of hers was proof that I had not been mistaken. Then she went on to add this: "But I had a right to resume it, because the promises made to me have not been kept, promises that I should be allowed to go to Mass and receive the communion, and that I should be freed from the bondage of these chains, but they are still upon me, as you see. Nevertheless, you have abjured, and have especially promised to return no more to the dress of a man." Then Joan held out her fettered hands sorrowfully toward these unfeeling men and said, "I would rather die than continue so. But if they may be taken off, and if I may hear Mass, and be removed to a penitential prison, and have a woman about me, I will be good, and will do what shall seem good to you that I do." Cauchon sniffed scoffingly at that. Honor the compact which he and his had made with her? Fulfill its conditions? What need of that? Conditions had been a good thing to concede, temporarily, and for advantage, but they have served their turn. Let something of a fresher sort and of more consequence be considered. The resumption of the male dress was sufficient for all practical purposes, but perhaps Joan could be led to add something to that fatal crime. So Cauchon asked her if her voices had spoken to her since Thursday, and he reminded her of her abjuration. "Yes," she answered. And then it came out that the voices had talked with her about the abjuration, told her about it, I suppose. She guilelessly reasserted the heavenly origin of her mission, and did it with the untroubled mien of one who was not conscious that she had ever knowingly repudiated it. So I was convinced once more that she had had no notion of what she was doing that Thursday morning on the platform. Finally she said, "My voices told me I did very wrong to confess that what I had done was not well." Then she sighed, and said with simplicity, "But it was the fear of the fire that made me do so." That is, fear of the fire had made her sign a paper whose contents she had not understood then, but understood now by revelation of her voices and by testimony of her persecutors. She was sane now and not exhausted, her courage had come back, and with it her inborn loyalty to the truth. She was bravely and serenely speaking it again, knowing that it would deliver her body up to that very fire which had such terrors for her. That answer of hers was quite long, quite frank, wholly free from concealments or palliations. It made me shudder. I knew she was pronouncing sentence of death upon herself. So did poor Mansion. And he wrote in the margin abreast of it. Responsio mortifera. Fatal answer. Yes, all present knew that it was, indeed, a fatal answer. Then there fell a silence such as falls in a sickroom when the watchers of the dying draw a deep breath and say softly one to another, "All is over." Here, likewise, all was over. But after some moments Cauchon, wishing to clinch this matter and make it final, put this question. "Do you still believe that your voices are Saint Marguerite and Saint Catherine?" "Yes, and that they come from God." "Yet you denied them on the scaffold?" Then she made direct and clear affirmation that she had never had any intention to deny them. And that I noted the if she had made some retractions and revocations on the scaffold it was from fear of the fire, and it was a violation of the truth. There it is again, you see. She certainly never knew what it was she had done on the scaffold until she was told of it afterward by these people and by her voices. And now she closed this most painful scene with these words. And there was a weary note in them that was pathetic. "I would rather do my penance all at once, let me die. I cannot endure captivity any longer." The spirit born for sunshine and liberty so longed for release that it would take it in any form, even that. Several among the company of judges went from the place troubled and sorrowful, the others in another mood. In the court of the castle we found the Earl of Warwick and 50 English waiting, impatient for news. As soon as Cauchon saw them he shouted, laughing, "Think of a man destroying a friendless poor girl and then having the heart to laugh at it. Make yourselves comfortable, it's all over with her." Chapter 23. The time is at hand. The young can sink into abysses of despondency, and it was so with Noel and me now, but the hopes of the young are quick to rise again, and it was so with ours. We called back that vague promise of the voices, and said the one to the other that the glorious release was to happen at the last moment, that other time was not the last moment, but this is. It will happen now, the king will come, La Hire will come, and with them our veterans, and behind them all France. And so we were full of heart again, and could already hear, in fancy, that stirring music, the clash of steel and the war cries and the uproar of the onset, and in fancy see our prisoner free. Her chains gone, her sword in her hand. But this dream was to pass also, and come to nothing. Late at night, when Mansion came in, he said, "I am come from the dungeon, and I have a message for you from that poor child." A message to me. If he had been noticing, I think he would have discovered that my indifference concerning the prisoner was a pretense. For I was caught off my guard, and was so moved and so exalted to be so honored by her that I must have shown my feeling in my face and manner. "A message for me, your reverence?" "Yes. It is something she wishes done. She said she had noticed the young man who helps me, and that he had a good face, and did I think he would do a kindness for her? I said I knew you would, and asked her what it was, and she said a letter. Would you write a letter to her mother? And I said you would. But I said I would do it myself, and gladly. But she said no, that my labors were heavy, and she thought the young man would not mind the doing of this service for one not able to do it for herself, she not knowing how to write. Then I would have sent for you, and at that the sadness vanished out of her face. Why, it was as if she was going to see a friend, poor friendless thing. But I was not permitted. I did my best, but the orders remain as strict as ever, the doors are closed against all but officials, as before, none but officials may speak to her. So I went back and told her, and she sighed, and was sad again. Now this is what she begs you to write to her mother. It is partly a strange message, and to me means nothing, but she said her mother would understand. You will convey her adoring love to her family and her village friends, and say there will be no rescue, for that this night, and it is the 3rd time in the 12th. And is final, she has seen the vision of the tree. How strange! Yes, it is strange, but that is what she said, and said her parents would understand. And for a little time she was lost in dreams and thinkings, and her lips moved, and I caught in her muttering these lines, which she said over 2 or 3 times. And they seemed to bring peace and contentment to her. I set them down, thinking they might have some connection with her letter and be useful, but it was not so. They were a mere memory, floating idly in a tired mind, and they have no meaning, at least no relevancy. I took the piece of paper, and found what I knew I should find. And when in exile wandering, we shall fainting yearn for glimpse of thee. Oh, rise upon our sight. There was no hope any more. I knew it now. I knew that Joan's letter was a message to Noel and me, as well as to her family. And that its object was to banish vain hopes from our minds and tell us from her own mouth of the blow that was going to fall upon us, so that we, being her soldiers, would know it for a command to bear it as became us and her, and so submit to the will of God. And in thus obeying, find assuagement of our grief. It was like her, for she was always thinking of others, not of herself. Yes, her heart was sore for us. She could find time to think of us, the humblest of her servants, and try to soften our pain, lighten the burden of our troubles, she that was drinking of the bitter waters. She that was walking in the valley of the shadow of death. I wrote the letter. You will know what it cost me, without my telling you. I wrote it with the same wooden stylus which had put upon parchment the first words ever dictated by Joan of Arc, that high summons to the English to vacate France, 2 years past, when she was a lass of 17. It had now set down the last ones which she was ever to dictate. Then I broke it. For the pen that had served Joan of Arc could not serve any that would come after her in this earth without abasement. The next day, May 29th, Cauchon summoned his serfs, and 42 responded. It is charitable to believe that the other 20 were ashamed to come. The 42 pronounced her a relapsed heretic, and condemned her to be delivered over to the secular arm. Cauchon thanked them. Then he sent orders that Joan of Arc be conveyed the next morning to the place known as the Old Market, and that she be then delivered to the civil judge, and by the civil judge to the executioner. That meant she would be burnt. All the afternoon and evening of Tuesday, the 29th, the news was flying, and the people of the countryside flocking to Rouen to see the tragedy, all, at least, who could prove their English sympathies and count upon admission. The press grew thicker and thicker in the streets, the excitement grew higher and higher. And now a thing was noticeable again which had been noticeable more than once before, that there was pity for Joan in the hearts of many of these people. Whenever she had been in great danger it had manifested itself, and now it was apparent again, manifest in a pathetic dumb sorrow which was visible in many faces. Early the next morning, Wednesday, Martin Ladvenu and another friar were sent to Joan to prepare her for death, and Mansion and I went with them, a hard service for me. We tramped through the dim corridors, winding this way and that, and piercing ever deeper and deeper into that vast heart of stone, and at last we stood before Joan. But she did not know it. She sat with her hands in her lap and her head bowed, thinking, and her face was very sad. One might not know what she was thinking of. Of her home, and the peaceful pastures, and the friends she was no more to see. Of her wrongs, and her forsaken estate, and the cruelties which had been put upon her. Or was it of death, the death which she had longed for, and which was now so close? Or was it of the kind of death she must suffer? I hoped not. For she feared only one kind, and that one had for her unspeakable terrors. I believed she so feared that one that with her strong will she would shut the thought of it wholly out of her mind, and hope and believe that God would take pity on her and grant her an easier one. And so it might chance that the awful news which we were bringing might come as a surprise to her at last. We stood silent a while, but she was still unconscious of us, still deep in her sad musings and far away. Then Martin Ladvenu said, softly, "Joan." She looked up then, with a little start, and a wan smile, and said, "Speak. Have you a message for me?" "Yes, my poor child." "Try to bear it." "Do you think you can bear it?" "Yes," very softly, and her head drooped again. "I am come to prepare you for death." A faint shiver trembled through her wasted body. There was a pause. In the stillness we could hear our breathings. Then she said, still in that low voice. "When will it be?" The muffled notes of a tolling bell floated to our ears out of the distance. "Now. The time is at hand." That slight shiver passed again. "It is so soon, ah, it is so soon." There was a long silence. The distant throbbings of the bell pulsed through it, and we stood motionless and listening. But it was broken at last. "What death is it?" "By fire." "Oh, I knew it, I knew it." She sprang wildly to her feet, and wound her hands in her hair, and began to writhe and sob, oh, so piteously, and mourn and grieve and lament, and turn to first one and then another of us, and search our faces beseechingly, as hoping she might find help and friendliness there. Poor thing, she that had never denied these to any creature, even her wounded enemy on the battlefield. Oh, cruel, cruel, to treat me so. And must my body, that has never been defiled, be consumed today and turned to ashes? Ah, sooner would I that my head were cut off 7 times than suffer this woeful death. I had the promise of the Church's prison when I submitted, and if I had but been there, and not left here in the hands of my enemies, this miserable fate had not befallen me. Oh, I appeal to God the great Judge, against the injustice which has been done me. There was none there that could endure it. They turned away, with the tears running down their faces. In a moment I was on my knees at her feet. At once she thought only of my danger, and bent and whispered in my ear, "Up, do not peril yourself, good heart. There, God bless you always." And I felt the quick clasp of her hand. Mine was the last hand she touched with hers in life. None saw it, history does not know of it or tell of it, yet it is true, just as I have told it. The next moment she saw Cauchon coming, and she went and stood before him and reproached him, saying, "Bishop, it is by you that I die." He was not shamed, not touched, but said, smoothly, "Ah, be patient, Joan. You die because you have not kept your promise, but have returned to your sins." "Alas," she said, "if you had put me in the Church's prison, and given me right and proper keepers, as you promised, this would not have happened. And for this I summon you to answer before God." Then Cauchon winced, and looked less placidly content than before, and he turned him about and went away. Joan stood a while musing. She grew calmer, but occasionally she wiped her eyes, and now and then sobs shook her body, but their violence was modifying now, and the intervals between them were growing longer. Finally she looked up and saw Pierre Maurice, who had come in with the bishop, and she said to him, "Master Peter, where shall I be this night? Have you not good hope in God?" "Yes, and by his grace I shall be in paradise." Now Martin Ladvenu heard her in confession, then she begged for the sacrament. But how grant the communion to one who had been publicly cut off from the Church, and was now no more entitled to its privileges than an unbaptized pagan? The brother could not do this, but he sent to Cauchon to inquire what he must do. All laws, human and divine, were alike to that man, he respected none of them. He sent back orders to grant Joan whatever she wished. Her last speech to him had reached his fears, perhaps, it could not reach his heart, for he had none. The Eucharist was brought now to that poor soul that had yearned for it with such unutterable longing all these desolate months. It was a solemn moment. While we had been in the deeps of the prison, the public courts of the castle had been filling up with crowds of the humbler sort of men and women, who had learned what was going on in Joan's cell, and had come with softened hearts to do, they knew not what. To hear, they knew not what. We knew nothing of this, for they were out of our view. And there were other great crowds of the like caste gathered in masses outside the castle gates. And when the lights and the other accompaniments of the sacrament passed by, coming to Joan in the prison, all those multitudes kneeled down and began to pray for her, and many wept. And when the solemn ceremony of the communion began in Joan's cell, out of the distance a moving sound was borne moaning to our ears. it was those invisible multitudes chanting the litany for a departing soul. The fear of the fiery death was gone from Joan of Arc now, to come again no more, except for one fleeting instant, then it would pass. And serenity and courage would take its place and abide till the end. Chapter 24. Joan the Martyr. At 9 o'clock the Maid of Orleans, deliverer of France, went forth in the grace of her innocence and her youth to lay down her life for the country she loved with such devotion. And for the king that had abandoned her. She sat in the cart that is used only for felons. In one respect she was treated worse than a felon. For whereas she was on her way to be sentenced by the civil arm, she already bore her judgment inscribed in advance upon a mitre-shaped cap which she wore. Heretic, relapsed, apostate, idolater. In the cart with her sat the friar Martin Ladvenu and Maître Jean Massou. She looked girlishly fair and sweet and saintly in her long white robe. And when a gush of sunlight flooded her as she emerged from the gloom of the prison and was yet for a moment still framed in the arch of the sombre gate, the massed multitudes of poor folk murmured, "A vision! A vision!" and sank to their knees praying, and many of the women weeping. And the moving invocation for the dying arose again, and was taken up and borne along, a majestic wave of sound, which accompanied the doomed, solacing and blessing her. All the sorrowful way to the place of death. Christ have pity. Saint Margaret have pity. Pray for her, all ye saints, archangels, and blessed martyrs, pray for her. Saints and angels intercede for her. From thy wrath, good Lord, deliver her. O Lord God, save her. Have mercy on her, we beseech thee, good Lord. It is just and true what one of the histories has said, the poor and the helpless had nothing but their prayers to give Joan of Arc, but these we may believe were not unavailing. There are few more pathetic events recorded in history than this weeping, helpless, praying crowd. Holding their lighted candles and kneeling on the pavement beneath the prison walls of the old fortress. And it was so all the way, thousands upon thousands massed upon their knees and stretching far down the distances, thick sown with the faint yellow candle flames. Like a field starred with golden flowers. But there were some that did not kneel, these were the English soldiers. They stood elbow to elbow, on each side of Joan's road, and walled it in all the way. And behind these living walls knelt the multitudes. By and by a frantic man in priest's garb came wailing and lamenting. And tore through the crowd and the barriers of soldiers and flung himself on his knees by Joan's cart and put up his hands in supplication, crying out, "Oh forgive, forgive." It was Loiseleur. And Joan forgave him. Forgave him out of a heart that knew nothing but forgiveness, nothing but compassion, nothing but pity for all that suffer, let their offense be what it might. And she had no word of reproach for this poor wretch who had wrought day and night with deceits and treacheries and hypocrisies to betray her to her death. The soldiers would have killed him, but the Earl of Warwick saved his life. What became of him is not known. He hid himself from the world somewhere, to endure his remorse as he might. In the square of the old market stood the two platforms and the stake that had stood before in the churchyard of St. Ouen. The platforms were occupied as before, the one by Joan and her judges, the other by great dignitaries, the principal being Cauchon and the English Cardinal, Winchester. The square was packed with people, the windows and roofs of the blocks of buildings surrounding it were black with them. When the preparations had been finished, all noise and movement gradually ceased, and a waiting stillness followed which was solemn and impressive. And now, by order of Cauchon, an ecclesiastic named Nicholas Midi preached a sermon, wherein he explained that when a branch of the vine, which is the church, becomes diseased and corrupt, it must be cut away or it will corrupt and destroy the whole vine. He made it appear that Joan, through her wickedness, was a menace and a peril to the church's purity and holiness, and her death therefore necessary. When he was come to the end of his discourse he turned toward her and paused a moment, then he said, "Joan, the church can no longer protect you. Go in peace. Joan had been placed wholly apart and conspicuous, to signify the Church's abandonment of her, and she sat there in her loneliness, waiting in patience and resignation for the end. Cauchon addressed her now. He had been advised to read the form of her abjuration to her, and had brought it with him. But he changed his mind, fearing that she would proclaim the truth, that she had never knowingly abjured, and so bring shame upon him and eternal infamy. He contented himself with admonishing her to keep in mind her wickednesses, and repent of them, and think of her salvation. Then he solemnly pronounced her excommunicate and cut off from the body of the Church. With a final word he delivered her over to the secular arm for judgment and sentence. Joan, weeping, knelt and began to pray. For whom? Herself? Oh, no, for the King of France. Her voice rose sweet and clear, and penetrated all hearts with its passionate pathos. She never thought of his treacheries to her, she never thought of his desertion of her, she never remembered that it was because he was an ingrate that she was here to die a miserable death. She remembered only that he was her king, that she was his loyal and loving subject, and that his enemies had undermined his cause with evil reports and false charges. And he not by to defend himself. And so, in the very presence of death, she forgot her own troubles to implore all in her hearing to be just to him. To believe that he was good and noble and sincere, and not in any way to blame for any acts of hers, neither advising them nor urging them, but being wholly clear and free of all responsibility for them. Then, closing, she begged in humble and touching words that all here present would pray for her and would pardon her. Both her enemies and such as might look friendly upon her and feel pity for her in their hearts. There was hardly one heart there that was not touched, even the English, even the judges showed it, and there was many a lip that trembled and many an eye that was blurred with tears. Yes, even the English cardinals, that man with a political heart of stone but a human heart of flesh. The secular judge who should have delivered judgment and pronounced sentence was himself so disturbed that he forgot his duty. And Joan went to her death unsentenced, thus completing with an illegality what had begun illegally and had so continued to the end. He only said, to the guards, "Take her, and to the executioner, do your duty." Joan asked for a cross. None was able to furnish one. But an English soldier broke a stick in two and crossed the pieces and tied them together, and this cross he gave her, moved to it by the good heart that was in him. And she kissed it and put it in her bosom. Then Isambard de la Pierre went to the church near by and brought her a consecrated one. And this one also she kissed, and pressed it to her bosom with rapture, and then kissed it again and again, covering it with tears and pouring out her gratitude to God and the saints. And so, weeping, and with her cross to her lips, she climbed up the cruel steps to the face of the stake, with the friar Isambard at her side. Then she was helped up to the top of the pile of wood that was built around the lower third of the stake and stood upon it with her back against the stake, and the world gazing up at her breathless. The executioner ascended to her side and wound chains around her slender body, and so fastened her to the stake. Then he descended to finish his dreadful office. And there she remained alone, she that had had so many friends in the days when she was free, and had been so loved and so dear. All these things I saw, albeit dimly and blurred with tears. But I could bear no more. I continued in my place, but what I shall deliver to you now I got by others' eyes and others' mouths. Tragic sounds there were that pierced my ears and wounded my heart as I sat there. But it is as I tell you, the latest image recorded by my eyes in that desolating hour was Joan of Arc with the grace of her comely youth still unmarred. And that image, untouched by time or decay, has remained with me all my days. Now I will go on. If any thought that now, in that solemn hour when all transgressors repent and confess, she would revoke her revocation and say her great deeds had been evil deeds and Satan and his fiends their source, they erred. No such thought was in her blameless mind. She was not thinking of herself and her troubles, but of others, and of woes that might befall them. And so, turning her grieving eyes about her, where rose the towers and spires of that fair city, she said, Oh, Rouen, Rouen, must I die here, and must you be my tomb? Ah, Rouen, Rouen, I have great fear that you will suffer for my death. A whiff of smoke swept upward past her face, and for one moment terror seized her and she cried out, "Water! Give me holy water," but the next moment her fears were gone, and they came no more to torture her. She heard the flames crackling below her, and immediately distress for a fellow creature who was in danger took possession of her. It was the friar Isambard. She had given him her cross and begged him to raise it toward her face and let her eyes rest in hope and consolation upon it till she was entered into the peace of God. She made him go out from the danger of the fire. Then she was satisfied, and said, "Now keep it always in my sight until the end." Not even yet could Cauchon, that man without shame, endure to let her die in peace, but went toward her, all black with crimes and sins as he was, and cried out, "I am come, Joan, to exhort you for the last time to repent and seek the pardon of God. I die through you," she said, and these were the last words she spoke to any upon earth. Then the pitchy smoke, shot through with red flashes of flame, rolled up in a thick volume and hid her from sight. And from the heart of this darkness her voice rose strong and eloquent in prayer, and when by moments the wind shredded somewhat of the smoke aside, there were veiled glimpses of an upturned face and moving lips. At last a mercifully swift tide of flame burst upward, and none saw that face any more nor that form, and the voice was still. Yes, she was gone from us, Joan of Arc. What little words they are, to tell of a rich world made empty and poor. Conclusion. Joan's brother Jacques died in Domremy during the great trial at Rouen. This was according to the prophecy which Joan made that day in the pastures, the time that she said the rest of us would go to the great wars. When her poor old father heard of the martyrdom it broke his heart and he died. The mother was granted a pension by the city of Orleans, and upon this she lived out her days, which were many. 24 years after her illustrious child's death she traveled all the way to Paris in the wintertime and was present at the opening of the discussion in the Cathedral of Notre Dame, which was the first step in the rehabilitation. Paris was crowded with people, from all about France, who came to get sight of the venerable dame. And it was a touching spectacle when she moved through these reverent wet-eyed multitudes on her way to the grand honors awaiting her at the cathedral. With her were Jean and Pierre, no longer the light-hearted youths who marched with us from Vaucouleurs, but war-torn veterans with hair beginning to show frost. After the martyrdom Noël and I went back to Domremy, but presently when the Constable Richemont superseded La Tremouille as the king's chief adviser and began the completion of Joan's great work, we put on our harness and returned to the field and fought for the king all through the wars and skirmishes until France was freed of the English. It was what Joan would have desired of us, and, dead or alive, her desire was law for us. All the survivors of the personal staff were faithful to her memory and fought for the king to the end. Mainly we were well scattered, but when Paris fell we happened to be together. It was a great day and a joyous. But it was a sad one at the same time, because Joan was not there to march into the captured capital with us. Noël and I remained always together, and I was by his side when death claimed him. It was in the last great battle of the war. In that battle fell also Joan's sturdy old enemy Talbot. He was 85 years old, and had spent his whole life in battle. A fine old lion he was, with his flowing white mane and his tameless spirit, yes, and his indestructible energy as well, for he fought as knightly and vigorous a fight that day as the best man there. La Hire survived the martyrdom 13 years, and always fighting, of course, for that was all he enjoyed in life. I did not see him in all that time, for we were far apart, but one was always hearing of him. The bastard of Orleans and d'Alençon and d'Aulon lived to see France free, and to testify with Jean and Pierre d'Arc and Pasquerel and me at the rehabilitation. But they are all at rest now, these many years. I alone am left of those who fought at the side of Joan of Arc in the great wars. She said I would live until those wars were forgotten, a prophecy which failed. If I should live 1,000 years it would still fail. For whatsoever had touch with Joan of Arc, that thing is immortal. Members of Joan's family married, and they have left descendants. Their descendants are of the nobility, but their family name and blood bring them honors which no other nobles receive or may hope for. You have seen how everybody along the way uncovered when those children came yesterday to pay their duty to me. It was not because they are noble, it is because they are grandchildren of the brothers of Joan of Arc. Now as to the rehabilitation. Joan crowned the king at Reims. For reward he allowed her to be hunted to her death without making one effort to save her. During the next 23 years he remained indifferent to her memory. Indifferent to the fact that her good name was under a damning blot put there by the priest because of the deeds which she had done in saving him and his scepter. Indifferent to the fact that France was ashamed, and longed to have the deliverer's fair fame restored. Indifferent all that time. Then he suddenly changed and was anxious to have justice for poor Joan himself. Why? Had he become grateful at last? Had remorse attacked his hard heart? No. He had a better reason, a better one for his sort of man. This better reason was that, now that the English had been finally expelled from the country, they were beginning to call attention to the fact that this king had gotten his crown by the hands of a person proven by the priests to have been in league with Satan and burned for it by them as a sorceress, therefore. Of what value or authority was such a kingship as that? Of no value at all. No nation could afford to allow such a king to remain on the throne. It was high time to stir now, and the king did it. That is how Charles VII came to be smitten with anxiety to have justice done the memory of his benefactress. He appealed to the Pope, and the Pope appointed a great commission of churchmen to examine into the facts of Joan's life and award judgment. The commission sat at Paris, at Domremy, at Rouen, at Orleans, and at several other places, and continued its work during several months. It examined the records of Joan's trials, it examined the bastard of Orleans, and the Duc d'Alençon, and d'Aulon, and Pasquerel, and Courcelles, and Isambard de la Pierre, and Manchon, and me. And many others whose names I have made familiar to you. Also they examined more than 100 witnesses whose names are less familiar to you, friends of Joan in Domremy, Vaucouleurs, Orleans, and other places. And a number of judges and other people who had assisted at the Rouen trials, the abjuration, and the martyrdom. And out of this exhaustive examination Joan's character and history came spotless and perfect, and this verdict was placed upon record, to remain forever. I was present upon most of these occasions, and saw again many faces which I have not seen for a quarter of a century. Among them some well-beloved faces, those of our generals and that of Catherine Boucher, married, alas. And also among them certain other faces that filled me with bitterness, those of Beaupère and Courcelles and a number of their fellow fiends. I saw Haumette and little Mengette, edging along toward 50 now, and mothers of many children. I saw Noel's father, and the parents of the Paladin and the Sunflower. It was beautiful to hear the Duc d'Alençon praise Joan's splendid capacities as a general. And to hear the bastard endorse these praises with his eloquent tongue and then go on and tell how sweet and good Joan was, and how full of pluck and fire and impetuosity, and mischief, and mirthfulness, and tenderness, and compassion, and everything that was pure and fine and noble and lovely. He made her live again before me, and wrung my heart. I have finished my story of Joan of Arc, that wonderful child, that sublime personality. That spirit which in one regard has had no peer and will have none, this, its purity from all alloy of self-seeking, self-interest, personal ambition. In it no trace of these motives can be found, search as you may, and this cannot be said of any other person whose name appears in profane history. With Joan of Arc love of country was more than a sentiment, it was a passion. She was the genius of patriotism, she was patriotism embodied, concreted, made flesh, and palpable to the touch and visible to the eye. Love, mercy, charity, fortitude, war, peace, poetry, music, these may be symbolized as any shall prefer, by figures of either sex and of any age. But a slender girl in her first young bloom, with the martyr's crown upon her head, and in her hand the sword that severed her country's bonds, shall not this, and no other, stand for patriotism through all the ages until time shall end?